Hey friends, before we dive into tonight's story, did you know that nearly 80% of the people who watch these videos aren't subscribed? If you're enjoying this kind of content, consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps a lot, and it keeps these long stories going. Also, I'd love to hear from you. What time is it right now where you are, and which city are you listening from tonight? And if these stories help you sleep, feel free to tap the thanks button to support the channel. It truly means a lot. All right, let's get into it. The night air felt like ice against my face as I climbed into the rear of the armored van. Rain slicked off the roof overhead, and the hum of idling engines reverberated through the cabin. I tightened the chin strap on my helmet, listening to the familiar hiss of my radios activating. As Sergeant Reyes, I'd spent more nights gearing up for calls like this than I cared to remember. The clock read 2:04 a.m. as our team leader, Lieutenant Diaz, keyed the radio. All units, move out. Suspect barricaded in 3B, Elmwood Heights. Possible hostage. Intel. Male, mid-30s, prior domestic violence. Respond code, silent. He didn't bother to spell everything out. I'd learned long ago not to wait for the details. You strapped on your gear, you moved when you moved, and you trusted your training. Kevlar plates shifted against my chest as I settled into position. My finger hovered near the activation switch for my helmet cam, but the feed still flickered from the last time I'd powered it up. I exhaled slowly, forcing a measure of calm into my lungs. Each breath tasted like bitter adrenaline. Across from me, Corporal Jenkins smoothed down his tactical vest, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. We'd worked together through half a dozen call-outs this month. Hostage rescues, high-risk arrests, search warrants that spiraled out of control. By now, we knew each other's tells. The way Kev's jaw would tighten when he was about to snap to attention. The slight tremor in his gloved hand when he was bracing for a breach. We shared that silent understanding. The tacit agreement to watch each other's backs, no matter what. The van lurched forward, tires splashing through shallow puddles. Our headlights cut through sheets of rain as we approached Elmwood Heights, a squat brick complex nestled on the fringe of the city. The parking lot was empty except for one battered sedan with its lights still on. A patrol car that had already been pinned against the curb. Wet asphalt shimmered ahead, and a single street lamp cast a weak halo through the haze. I caught sight of the building's graffiti-tagged entrance, the letters blurred by moisture. A flickering bulb in the hallway sputtered out as we pulled up. We piled out, boots slapping on the pavement. I felt the sting of cold rain against my neck, the Velcro straps of my gloves squeaking as I drove them over my fingers. The world smelled of damp concrete and rust. My left hand brushed the rough weave of my bulletproof vest as I fell into a crouch beside Jenkins. In front of us, the stairwell door to the third floor loomed closed and padlocked. I glanced at Diaz, who gave a curt nod, and then I stepped forward, keying my radio. Team 1, on me, breach in 30. Inside the stairwell, concrete steps led up 3 flights, each one creaking under our weight. I counted in my mind, trying to maintain control of my breathing. 1, 2, 3. I flicked on the small LED on my forehead lamp. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling paint and damp walls. Every footstep echoed so loudly I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the static. Jenkins was right behind me, his silhouette moving like a shadow against the stained walls. The air was stale, stagnant, like no one had opened a window in weeks. By the time we reached the landing outside apartment 3B, the scent of mildew and something fouler clung to my throat. We formed our stack at the door, Jenkins with the shield, me directly behind him with a battering ram slung on my shoulder. Diaz taking up point. The lock on the door was heavy-duty, industrial grade, an ominous sign that whoever was inside wasn't just hiding. Diaz tapped the door with his fist, then whispered into his mic. "Subject is armed. He fired a shot 15 minutes ago. Female voice heard screaming. Watch for improvised traps." There was no hesitation in his tone, just the cold recitation of critical details. I swallowed the lump in my throat and flipped the ram upward, gripping it tight. Lieutenant Diaz glanced back at me. "On my mark." He placed his gloved hand on the door. I felt the pulse of rain pattering on the roof above, the distant hum of the city machinery, muted and distant. He inched the door forward, testing the hinge. Then he stepped back and raised his hand. "Mark?" I planted my foot firmly on the floor, held my breath, and swung the ram downward. Crack. The impact rattled down the hallway like a gunshot. Splinters of wood rained from the doorframe. Debris sprayed into the narrow corridor. Everything seemed to slow in that split second. The echo of the blow, the flash of white paint beneath the wood, the dull skid of metal hardware against tile. Then the flashbang detonated. The corridor became a blinding sheet of white light. The bang, deafening, slammed into my chest and rattled my teeth. My helmet cam feed dissolved into snow and static, leaving nothing but a weightless nothingness behind my eyes. Ocular burn. My ears rang, and for an instant I was suspended in darkness. Then my vision returned with halos around every edge, the world fractured by sound. Lieutenant Diaz's voice cut through. "Move! Move!" I seized my shield, slammed it forward, and rushed in, adrenaline spiking like a drug. In the living room, chaos bore down on me like a wave. The floor was slick with rainwater that must have tracked in from the hallway. Each step felt precarious. A single overhead light flickered, illuminating an L-shaped couch pushed against a window smeared with raindrops. I saw the suspect at the far end of the room, a man in a white t-shirt, crouched behind a coffee table, muzzle of a handgun poking over the edge. His face was pale in the strobe of my flashlight, eyes wide with terror or defiance. I couldn't tell. Blood spattered the front of his shirt, staining it a dull crimson. He was breathing so fast I could hear it from across the room. His right hand found his stomach, where another splash of red pooled. I realized it was his blood. To the left, a small hallway led to a bedroom. I could make out a woman's shape crumpled against the doorframe. Her dark hair matted, jeans torn, crying softly. Even with ringing ears, I felt her fear as palpably as if it had knocked me aside. There was a box of children's toys, a toppled plastic truck, a doll with one glass eye staring intently. That sound rode alongside my own labored breathing. The hallway smelled of vomit and old pizza. No children were visible. Everything in that moment felt coated in a cold dread. I raised my arm to signal Diaz. "Suspect armed. He's wounded. Female possibly hostage in back bedroom." My voice cracked, and I knew the radio would be useless here, but I pressed on. Jenkins moved to my flank, shield erect. Behind us, the flashbang smoke curled in the air like looming tendrils, clinging to the ceiling. I took a step forward, my boots skidding on the slick tile. A drop of water fell from the ceiling onto my helmet, pattering down my face. The suspect shouted a word I couldn't make out, something like a plea or a curse. His pistol swung toward me. Everything slowed, the flicker of his finger tightening on the trigger, the flash of metal as he leveled the gun. I registered the moment before he fired. How unreal it felt, like watching a train wreck in slow motion. My world constricted to the twisted barrel pointed at me, and that second of premonition was worse than anything I'd faced before. The shot rang out, and I saw the muzzle flash within the cave of his palm. I felt the bullet slam into my forearm, hot, searing, ripping through flesh and bone. A white-hot shock rocketed up my arm, and my teeth rattled once from the impact. Burning pain exploded across my skin. My vision momentarily wavered. I ignored it. My shield collided with his elbow, crushing him backward. A wet pop echoed as his pistol clattered to the floor. He sagged over the coffee table, cradling his bleeding side. My training kicked in. Move, secure, contain. I advanced, breaking his attempts at a second shot by levering my shield against his arm. The world shrank to that single hallway, his ragged breathing mixing with the drip of blood against tile. Lieutenant Diaz and 2 medics flooded in behind me, and the suspect collapsed entirely, slump and still, his eyes glassy. I stumbled back, clutching my arm as the pain flared again. The burnt fabric of my sleeve had split, revealing a sight I couldn't unsee. Bright red seeping through white cotton, a dark bruise forming. I allowed myself a second to focus on the sting, then turned and sprinted down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was cracked, and I pushed it open with my boot. The woman inside, a child in her arms, looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She was slender, painted nails chipped, wearing a floral nightgown stained in places I didn't want to examine. Her daughter, a toddler, pale and shaking, stared back with wonder, clutching a ragged bunny toy to her chest. My heart twisted. Add one more casualty to the roster, I thought, but miraculously she was unhurt. The mother's sobs racked her shoulders as she set her daughter down gently, rocking her back and forth. "Thank God," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the little girl. "Thank you." She glanced up at me, green eyes wide with uncertainty and relief. I nodded, swallowing. I wanted to say something, but no words came. The corridor erupted behind me in a flurry of boots and medical orders. I retreated slowly, pressing my back against the blood-slick wall. A medic rushed past, dragging a gurney. I watched them load the father, handcuffed, pale, bleeding, into a wheelchair. He moaned something incoherent as nurses applied pressure to his wound. I could almost see his thoughts: remorse, terror, disbelief that someone had come through his door, shoved him to the floor, and ripped away his gun. Just another suspect they told us about. Just another SWAT call-out. By the time I reached the stairwell, my arm was numb and heavy. I glanced down the bunkering of steps, the cracked concrete and damp corners. Jenkins fell into step beside me, carrying the shield. Neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain had eased to a light drizzle. I staggered to my van, flinching as I removed my glove and pressed a towel to my arm. Blood soaked the cloth so quickly that it dripped in rivulets to the ground. I bit down on the inside of my cheek to keep from yelling. Lieutenant Diaz approached, eyes dark in the glow of the street lamp. "Reyes, you still with me?" he asked quietly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. My vision doubled and the world blurred for a second. He rested a hand on my shoulder, just a light touch, but it anchored me in some way. "You did good," he said, voice low. "That kid—" He trailed off. We both knew the toddler had no injuries. That child was the only innocent who walked out of there. The rest of us carried the stains: a father's blood, a bullet's hole, a hallway soaked through with grief. I sank to a step in the van's entry, breathing hard. My mind replayed everything: the sound of the flashbang, the echo of that gunshot in the narrow room, the father's blank stare as he realized what he'd done. My ribs ached from the rumble of the blast. My forearm burned like a branding iron. But what haunted me most was the moment I knocked that door down, forcing open a world I couldn't unsee. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing out the swirl of panic in my chest. The rain dripped onto my helmet in a steady patter, and the world remained mercifully silent. A medic clasped gauze around my wound. The pressure burned, but it forced me to focus. I watched him work, hands steady, wrapping the cloth tight. Neither of us spoke. The second skin of pain settled over my arm like a promise. I looked past him at the doorway of the apartment building. Dark now, emptied of its horrors, except for the flicker of a hallway bulb. I knew that hallway would haunt me too. The cracked tile, the overturned coffee table, the toys scattered across the floor like broken promises. I would see them whenever I closed my eyes. Lieutenant Diaz's voice cut through my thoughts. "Reyes, you're going to need surgery. We'll get you to the hospital. Rest up. You earned it." I traced the edge of my helmet cam, still smeared with rainwater and static. Who needed footage when the memory was seared in every nerve ending? I nodded again, though I wasn't sure what rest meant anymore. Tomorrow, they would call it a success. Suspect apprehended, hostage safe, minimal structural damage. But I already knew the truth. Some things don't stay confined to an apartment. Memories don't stay on the other side of a door. They follow you home. My boots hit the wet pavement as I stepped out toward the ambulance. Overhead, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving only the soft hiss of the wind. I kept my eyes on the ground, on the thin line of blood that led from the curb to my van. Somewhere in that place, between life and death, between right and wrong, a part of me stayed behind. I could still hear the echo of that lullaby playing in the background, mocking me with its innocence. I touched my arm where the medic had left the gauze. The sting reminded me that I was alive. But what was the point of being alive if I couldn't unsee what I'd seen? I closed my eyes against the streetlight's glare. I imagined that hallway for one more heartbeat, the flicker of the overhead bulb, the way the tiles reflected the flash of my weapon's muzzle. The father's eyes filled with something I couldn't name. And then I exhaled, letting the night absorb my breath. The van door shut behind me with a dull click, sealing away the world I'd entered. As the ambulance pulled away, I found myself wishing I could pull the same trick on my mind. Lock the door, drop the key, and never return. But I knew better. Some doors don't stay closed. And when you switch off the engines and the sirens fade, you realize that the only thing left is the sound of your own thoughts, echoing in the darkness. The ambulance lurched to a stop outside the emergency bay of St. Patrick's Medical Center. I swallowed hard as they unloaded me on a stretcher, the dull thud matching the racing of my heart. A chorus of shouts and footsteps flooded in. Nurses in green scrubs, doctors with headlamps, medical students hovering. I tried to sit up to help, but the medic stationed at my side pressed a hand to my shoulder. "Lie still, Sergeant," he said, voice calm, but his eyes nothing but concern. Someone peeled back my shirt sleeve and pressed gauze into the wound, the pressure heating the pain into a white, hot flare. I gripped the edge of the stretcher railing, fingernails cutting into my palm, and felt bile rise in my throat. They wheeled me into an operating theater's glare. Bright lights bobbed overhead, sterile instruments glinting in their steel trays. My helmet cam hung from a hook near the workspace, droplets of rain still clinging to the edges of its lens. It felt wrong to see it there, almost like a severed piece of me. A surgeon's voice barely registered. Segmental humeral fracture, possible artery involvement. Prep him for immediate debridement and fixation. I heard them explain that the bullet had glanced off the bone, shattering fragments and sending shards of metal lacing through muscle. I remembered little else, only the cold sting of the knife to open my arm, the smell of antiseptic, and the grinding of bone. When I woke later, my throat sore from the breathing tube. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent strip lighting. My reconstruction of the last hours felt jagged. Episodes of white flashes, muffled yells, the constant ache that refused to relent. A nurse leaned over me as she checked my vitals. "Easy there, Sergeant Reyes. We patched you up. The wound's clean." They placed a titanium plate along the humerus. I reached up to touch the gauze, tentative, as though I might pull it away like an unwanted label. The moment my fingers brushed cloth, a shock raced through me. Pain, yes, but something deeper. The horror that inked itself into my memory. The smell of burned copper and the way the floor had trembled like a living thing at the moment the bullet exploded through me. My vision tunneled. I closed my eyes, and for a split second I was back inside Elmwood Heights. The echo of my boots, the father's collapse, that toddler's wide stare. I gripped the mattress rail to stop myself from sinking. The nurse adjusted my IV, her face sympathetic. "Try to rest," she said. Rest. The word felt impossible. Eventually, someone wheeled me down a corridor toward radiology for a follow-up X-ray. I had to lean on a stretcher as they slid my arm under the scanner. I watched the screen flicker to life. Bone shards clinging to metal. The bullet's path jagged as if ripped by some animal's claw. The technician said nothing as she snapped the image, then whispered quietly, "You're lucky. You could have lost the arm." I forced a nod, even though I felt anything but lucky. That statement spun in my skull. Lucky, the arm intact, yet my soul felt shredded in ways that no scanner could expose. By the time I was discharged 3 days later, my arm was encased in a brace, each movement a reminder of how fragile I'd become. I hobbled to my car, with one crutch under my armpit, the other tucked neatly between my good arm and side. Rain had returned, a steady drizzle that coated the parking garage above. My unit's lieutenant appeared at the curb, eyes dark under the brim of his cap. He didn't ask for details he'd heard. He simply handed me a uniform top, size large, baggy on my bruised frame. "They want I back on the truck," he said. His tone was flat. "We got a call for a domestic disturbance tonight. SWAT not requested yet, but they want you there." I looked up at his face, hollowed by worry, centered on a mission, realized there was no space for me to linger in anything but action. I nodded stiffly and shuffled toward the van, my crutch skidding against wet concrete. The engine's roar sounded too loud, like an alarm in my skull. I slid onto the passenger bench, and Jenkins was already seated behind the wheel, face turned away, fiddling absent-mindedly with a rolled-up map. He glanced at me, but said nothing. The van pulled away, tires whining, and my world narrowed to the drag of crutches, the dull clench of pain in my forearm, and the echo of that toddler's cry. They'd scheduled me for desk duty, official protocol, but I found it impossible to sit at a computer all day. Instead, I spent hours in the locker room, taping my arm, testing the brace, learning how not to wince when the slightest pressure landed on that tender spot. My wife, Karen, hovered nearby with a face nearly as ashen as mine. She'd insisted on coming to the hospital, but I evaded her by telling her I needed rest. She stood outside my bedroom door that first night, listening to my labored breathing. When I finally drifted off, it was into a world where gunshots and lullabies collided in the same echo chamber. The sun that day, pale, weak, seemed to mock me with its brightness. I sat on our sofa, arm in a sling, staring at the muted TV. A morning news anchor rattled off traffic updates, stock numbers, weather forecasts, mundane things I couldn't care about right then. All I felt was a lead weight in my chest, the arms of grief squeezing tight. I could still hear the father's scream, seared so deep into my nerves. I remembered the twitch of a finger on the trigger, the moment he realized he'd turned that revolver on his own son. The image of that boy's face, eyes glassy, skin pale, haunted me, and I couldn't carve out any space in my mind to shut it off. Karen approached tentatively, coffee cups in hand. She sat beside me, sliding one into my lap. The liquid steamed, scent sharp with caffeine. I wrapped my good hand around the mug, numbing myself to its warmth. My mind drifted back to the flashbang's blast, how it shook me so hard I feared my teeth would shatter. I focused on breathing, inhale, exhale, as though counting would somehow keep the memories at bay. But as soon as I closed my eyes, they came, the sound of glass shattering, the pop of the gun, the father's fall. Even now, hours later, the echo was fresh, as though timing had no hold on it. "I'm thinking of putting you on light duty for another week," Karen said softly. Her voice trembled with something unnameable, fear, sadness, frustration. "The trauma nurse called. She said you should talk to someone." My jaw snapped shut. Trauma nurse. Talk to someone. I turned to look at her, dark circles under her eyes, pencil-thin brows drawn tight. Talk to who? Some shrink who asks me if my mommy issues are the root cause of me getting shot. I forced a laugh that came out hollow. She cringed. "That's not fair," she whispered, but I couldn't bear to look at her longer. I set my cup down and stood abruptly. The room spun. I took a shaky step toward the door. "I need to get out," I said. She tried to stop me, but I brushed past, crutch clattering, and escaped into the hallway. In the driveway, the sky was clear for the first time since the shooting. A waning moon hovered thin above the trees. I perched against the hood of my car, crutch leaning beside me, and stared out at the neighborhood. Trimmed hedges, forlorn streetlights, a dog barking in the distance. I closed my good eye and forced myself to focus on star patterns. Something about the steady blink of those distant fires grounded me. I took a deep breath, willing the walls in my mind to hold steady, but the hollow ache in my chest remained. I knew this night would be long. I shoved the door open and climbed into the driver's seat. My hand shook so badly I almost let go of the wheel. I started the engine and drove aimlessly, down quiet streets where windows cast pale, square lights onto sidewalks damp with dew. I thought about the day ahead, filing a report, going to physical therapy, facing my team's questions. I tried to imagine finding solace in my bed, any sleep that wasn't riddled with nightmares. But every dark avenue I passed reminded me of that hallway, the flickering bulb, the puddles of water, the splintered door. There was nowhere I could go to escape that. I ended up at McAllister's diner, half empty, neon lights flickering overhead. I ordered black coffee and sat in a booth facing the vinyl wall. Steam curled from my mug as I stared at its surface, watching the ripples formed by my hands tremble. A waitress brought a slice of pie I didn't ask for, apple, warm, drizzled with caramel. She nodded at my uniform top, slung across the seat. "You okay?" she asked, voice gentle. I nodded, but I didn't trust my own answer. She walked away, and I took a bite of the pie. Sweetness clashed with bitterness. A sensation I could taste, but not fully remember when I had last felt normal. The diner's speakers played some old rock ballad, familiar, melancholic. I took another sip of coffee, letting the burn chase the taste of fear from my throat. Around me, strangers chatted quietly about sports scores, their conversations fractured by the door opening and closing. I envied their minds, unburdened by the knowledge of a bullet's jagged path through flesh, of a father's irreversible scream, of a toddler's life extinguished in a matter of heartbeats. I sat until my mug was empty and the pie plate scraped clean. My crutch tapped against the linoleum as I stood to leave. The waitress offered a sympathetic nod, but no words. I paid my bill and walked out, blinking in the neon glow. The world outside felt both sharp and hollow, like standing on the edge of a dream I couldn't fathom fully. My breath misted in the cool air as I fumbled for the car keys. That next morning, I made my way to the precinct for my first light-duty shift. My car's wipers squeaked as they cleared the drizzle, and the seatbelt cut into my torso oddly, like an unwanted grip. Inside the station, the fluorescent lighting felt too bright, too clinical. Family photos lined the walls, retirements, graduations, birthdays. None of them included me this week. I was simply a player in someone else's life until my arm healed. I avoided the usual benches by the bullpen and took a seat in the break room, arms folded across my chest, keeping my eyes on the clock. The minutes passed slowly, measured by the tick of the wall clock rather than urgency. Patrol officers drifted in and out. Some nodded curt hellos, others kept their distance. They didn't need to ask how I was. I could see it in their eyes. I felt the weight of their pity like a physical thing, pressing on my shoulders. I sipped a thermos of coffee, brought by a well-meaning colleague, and watched as the clock inched toward roll call. I half expected to hear the lieutenant's familiar bark. "Reyes, you're up." Instead, the sergeant on duty poked his head in. "Light duty for you today, Reyes." "Watch the security cameras." He gestured toward the bank of monitors. "Filing's been updated. You're covering paperwork for the domestic in Elmwood Heights." My stomach dropped. I knew that address. I stared at the screen that flickered with grainy CCTV footage of an apartment building lobby. I watched a woman in a white blouse drop her keys into a tray and sign for the evidence bag. Then I saw 2 LEOs wheel in a rolling case. Evidence preserved, that bullet fragment. A small pool of blood under the couch. I recognized the scene instantly, the coffee table, knocked askew. Remnants of that flashbang smoldering near the doorframe. The mother and child were nowhere to be seen, but every detail of that hallway refused to fade. I closed my eyes for a moment, blocking out the feed, but the sergeant continued. "Do the report, chain of custody logs, then send it to IA when you're done." He left without waiting for a response. I sat there, the noise of my own racing heartbeat filling my ears. The screen displayed the hallway, once more, the conduit between innocence and horror. I stared until my vision blurred, then looked away, focusing instead on the blank spreadsheet open on the desk. I tapped at the keys, entering data as though I were transcriptionist, and every keystroke felt like a drumbeat insisting I relive it. I completed the paperwork by mid-afternoon. My good arm throbbed from leaning over the desk, but it was the mental ache that burned hotter. My reflection in the monitor, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, looked stranger to me than the suspect's frozen face during the breach. I sent the files to Internal Affairs, then caught sight of a photo mounted above a woman's desk. A group of officers smiling in front of a patrol car. I reached my hand toward it, but the gesture faltered, and I dropped my palm onto the desk with a hollow thud. The hallway remained etched in my mind, more persistent than any photo. After killer paperwork, I made my way outside. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky was stained with gray. I boarded the loaner squad car parked outside. My personal cruiser was impounded until evidence tech was done with it, and ran my fingers over the steering wheel's worn leather. I drove home in silence, cadence measured by the windshield wipers. Along the way, every stalled intersection felt like a crucible. Bright headlights contrasted against darkened windows, reflections dancing on the wet road. I felt watched, as though the father's eyes still tracked me, reminding me of his plea. At home, the house felt enormous, empty. I peeled off my uniform top, careful not to disturb the brace on my arm. Inside the bedroom, Karen waited, but I hovered in the doorway, uncertain. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around my waist. Her breath smelled faintly of vanilla shampoo, her hair damp from the rain. "How was light duty?" she asked quietly. I wished she wouldn't ask. Every syllable reminded me of how far I'd drifted from normal life. I shook my head, lips pressed tight. "Don't ask," I said. She sighed, then took my hand, guiding me to the bed. She sat me down, adjusting my pillow so my arm was elevated. I used my good hand to brush a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just want you to," she began. "Please," I cut in. "I don't want to talk about it." Her eyes reddened, and she nodded. She got up to leave, but paused at the door. "Do you want dinner?" she asked, voice small. I closed my eyes, picturing that apartment's kitchen, the slick tile, the overturned toys, the father's collapse. "Not hungry," I whispered. She closed the door quietly. I stared at the white-painted wall and felt crumpled, like a rag someone had thrown away. I tried to shift my pillow, but the pressure against my arm shot a jolt of pain up my elbow. I gritted my teeth, pressing my eyes shut until spots of red danced in the black behind my lids. I didn't move again. Instead, I settled into my own silence, listening to the soft hum of the heater, imagining for a moment that if I could hold my breath long enough, everything would just go away. Days blurred into nights in a cycle fueled by coffee, physical therapy, and nightmares. I sketched out a timetable of visited moments in my mind: hospital, precinct, home, hoping to find a logical progression that would lead me back to stability. But stability seemed like a fairy tale told to others, not to me. My arm healed slowly. The surgeons kept telling me that range of motion would return, that scars faded. But the scar inside my skull, the one that ached with every drop of rain, seemed impervious to time. One morning, a week after being cleared for limited duty, I found myself at the range. It was supposed to be a standard firearms qualification to maintain certification. I pushed through the front doors of the indoor facility, the smell of gunpowder and rubber hitting me like a wall. My uniform top still bore a faint smear of blood, but the ammo on my belt was freshly issued. I had spent the night tossing in bed, haunted by the sound of that flashbang. I could still feel its concussion in my diaphragm. So I came here hoping for a release. The recoil, the focus on breathing. Anything but that hallway in Elmwood Heights. At the bench, I loaded my Glock and aimed downrange. Targets, paper silhouettes, stood 10 feet away, empty eyes mocking me. I took a deep breath, centered my stance, squeezed the trigger. The shot punched out, echoing in the cavernous room. The report cracked against the concrete walls. I felt the kick knead into my palm, a familiar burst of adrenaline. But the shot's echo was quickly replaced by the stillness. I didn't need to worry about a toddler or a gunman, no fear for life or death. I lined up the next round, but my vision wavered. I blinked, and for a fraction of a second, I was back at 3B's threshold, the flash of the lamp's halo, the father's scream dissolving into the buzz of the hallway light. I flinched, dropping the Glock to the table with a dull thud. My elbow twinged in protest, radiating pain. The range officer called out, but I couldn't register the words. I lifted my head, blinked, and saw my teammates behind the barrier, several of them giving me nods, tight-lipped. They'd been watching. I felt the weight of their eyes as though they saw me unraveling in slow motion. My face lost color. I couldn't do this. Too many memories compressed into every breath. I slung the gun belt off, dusting my hands on my uniform. "I'm done," I rasped, They called after me, but I was already gone. I hobbled to the exit, ignoring the rush of embarrassment that followed me. The drive home was a blur of tears and rain. I passed Elmwood Heights on the way, silent now, windows dark, no flicker of life to remind me that the apartment still existed. I swallowed and kept driving. That night, I tried sleep again. I lay on my back, propped up on pillows, the brace snug against my arm. The window was cracked open a sliver, enough for the lull of crickets and the whisper of wind. Somewhere in the distance a train rumbled, a solitary dog barked, and a baby cried. My breath caught. That familiar lullaby teased the edges of my mind. Hush, little baby. I clenched my good hand into a fist, trying to will the memory away. I reminded myself, home is safe. But the hallway in that apartment had taught me otherwise. I hoisted myself onto my side, trying to drift away. My brain conjured the hallway one last time. The flicker of the overhead bulb, the curve of the coffee table's edge, the slick tile reflecting the flash of a muzzle. I could almost feel the father's heartbeat thrumming in the darkness. I curled into a ball, and when my eyes closed I saw the crimson stain spreading across the floor, the father's empty eyes asking, "Why?" and the toddler's final breath. I woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The quilts were soaked with sweat. I sat up, arms around my knees, head heavy. Dawn was creeping in, the sky a pale wash of gray. I felt every bruise, every tendon's ache, every scar that refused to fade. I realized I couldn't keep doing this half alive. I needed a way forward, though I had no idea how. My mind roamed to the lieutenant's offer. SWAT would need me back, soon. They couldn't keep me on desk forever, and I knew they wouldn't try. I had to choose, walk away from the team that had been my family, or slog through these days with broken armor and a shattered mind. I stood up, shuffling to the bathroom. The mirror showed me a man hollowed by trauma. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, skin pale, arm held stiff to the side. I splashed water on my face. As the droplets slid down, I focused on tomorrow. The first day back on minimal shift, the unit brief, a new warrant to serve. I thought of vows I'd made to myself. Never to let fear freeze me again. But fear wasn't the worst of it. It was the guilt. That gnawing question I'd never answer. Could I have stopped it before it happened? Could I have saved that boy? I closed my eyes in the mirror, letting the water run its course. The hallway of Elmwood Heights stood between the board and my eyes, that broken door, the toys, the blood. I slid down so I was sitting on the cold tile floor, back against the wall, knees pressed to my chest. My arm throbbed. I cradled it as though cradling the memory itself, letting the pain anchor me in reality. I needed to let the guilt find its place without strangling me. Tomorrow I would walk onto the SWAT truck again, and I would not let this night follow me onto the mission. I exhaled, letting the sterile light wash over my face. For a fleeting second I imagined that hallway empty, tilt shifted, silent, unmarked by tragedy. Then I remembered it would never be that way. My eyes stung as I wiped off the fog of tears. I rose, gathering strength from the creak of my joints. I told myself I'd find a path forward, one step at a time. And as I turned from the mirror, I could feel the echo of that lullaby slipping away, replaced by a steadier beat, the simple act of breathing, of living another day. Even if I couldn't let go of what happened, maybe I could learn to carry it without letting it destroy me completely. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and when it did, I would answer the call. Morning light filtered through blinds as I eased out of bed on my first official day back in the field. My arm felt like a foreign object, weighted, stiff, a constant beacon of aching memory. I slid on a fresh uniform top, leaving the brace exposed beneath the sleeve. The fabric hung loosely around my torso. I wondered if anyone noticed the way I kept that arm pressed close. In the hallway outside my bedroom, Karen was already up, standing at the counter, measuring coffee grounds with a precision I envied. She didn't look up when I shuffled past, only nodded in acknowledgement as I moved toward the kitchen. I poured a cup of black coffee, the mug steaming like a small offering of normalcy. I took a long sip and tasted nothing but bitterness. I wondered if that flavor would follow me through the day. The drive to the precinct felt surreal. Familiar streets winding past shuttered storefronts, idling cars, a school bus parked at the end of the block even though it was Saturday. My cruiser, freshly cleaned standard issue, awaited in the lot, the engine purring to life with a press of a button. I felt a flicker of anticipation, a reminder of who I once was before the breach. But as I eased the car into the weekend traffic, that anticipation dissolved into a pit of dread. I forced myself to concentrate. Lights, sirens, dispatch tone, any vestige of duty that might chase away the ghosts. Elmwood Heights loomed in my windshield, same red brick facade I'd known so well. I blinked against the glare of the sun reflecting off broken glass near the entrance, as though the building itself refused to forget. I parked and climbed out, the cold air clinging to my face despite the hour. Today, I wasn't leading a SWAT call-out. I was on plain patrol, reacclimating. The sergeant on duty caught my eye as I approached. His nod was curt, professional, as though our conversation would come later. I offered a stiff nod in return and headed inside. Inside the bullpen, phones rang, keyboards clicked, and the scent of stale coffee mingled with paper. I took a seat at my assigned desk, logging into my workstation. A stack of incident reports waited, their pages thick with ink and shorthand. BART fights, stolen vehicles, minor disturbances. I tapped through them, mind buzzing with rote memorization while my thoughts hovered over that apartment's hallway, the visions never at rest. My desk phone buzzed. "Reyes," I answered. "Sergeant, we have a call at Elmwood Heights. Domestic disturbance, possible barricade," the dispatcher said. I felt my pulse spike. "Officer on scene is requesting backup. Would you respond?" I exhaled, voice calm. "On my way." I hung up and gathered my gear, radio, baton, cuffs. I left the brace when I reached for my weapon, no room for extra weight on my chest. I slid into my cruiser and flicked on the lights, heart slamming as I navigated toward the address. Elmwood Heights looked identical to that night, aside from the sunlit windows and the absence of the flashbang smoke stain. I parked behind a patrol car already angled across the lot. Patrol Officer Hernandez waved me over. She was pale but determined, eyes slightly sunken from hours of insomnia. "Thanks for coming, Sergeant. We got a male suspect, mid-30s. Neighbors reported shouting, glass breaking. Sounds familiar?" She forced a small, dry laugh. 340, just under me. I swallowed. I didn't want to go inside, but my title demanded it. I checked my pistol's chamber, heard the click reassuringly familiar. I grabbed my baton and approached the lobby, Hernandez at my side. The clerks behind the desk watched, faces etched with worry. The elevator doors lay open on the first floor, a few floors below where the disturbance was. We boarded, ascending to the third floor. Each ding of the elevator felt like a countdown, as though I was inching toward a memory that had no end. At the third floor landing, the hallway smelled of stale urine and burnt coffee. The walls, once freshly painted, now bore smudges where tenants had leaned or collided with strollers. Doors lined the corridor like silent sentinels, each one a potential danger zone. Hernandez pointed to a partially ajar door at 3D. He's in there. We heard growling, maybe a dog. We tried to call for compliance, but got no answer. I nodded. Let's do this. I pressed a finger to my radio. SWAT net, this is Reyes. Possible barricade. Stand by. No response. My heart fluttered in my chest, and I jostled that memory of flashbang flashes that had once consumed this same corridor. My arm ached sharply as though a ghost bullet had lodged there again. I reached the door, crouched beside it, and knocked 3 times. Police! Open the door! No reply. I could see a crack of a warm light bleeding from underneath, flickering like a heartbeat. I pressed my gloved ear to the wood. Low rumbling, like a growl or a shout, echoed from within. I ducked back, giving Hernandez room. Breach, I whispered. I reached for a small, handheld ram, a shorter version I could wield with one hand. Ramirez, our newest recruit, hesitated behind me. I glanced back. His face was pale, lips pressed tight. You good? I asked. He nodded, though I could see his eyes drifting toward the stairwell, maybe reminding himself of what could go wrong. Stay close, I told him, and moved forward. The ram struck the door with a dull thud. Crack. The lock gave way. I kicked the door inward, and it swung open to reveal darkness that yawned and swallowed me. I stepped inside, eyes searching for movement. The room felt different. It was narrow, cramped, with peeling wallpaper decorated in a pattern I couldn't make out in the low light. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, brown cardboard stained with the shapes of spilled liquids. A low growl emanated from the far corner, and I glimpsed a dog, chain-grown, teeth bared, about to lunge. Ramirez tensed, ready to step back. I barked to him, "Dog's hostile!" Ramirez pushed that cabinet toward it. Ramirez slid forward and shoved a rickety cabinet, blocking the animal's path. The dog snarled, but retreated behind the blockade. Before I could move further in, I saw him. A man crouched next to a small girl, maybe 5 years old, wrapped in a faded quilt. His knuckles were white as he clutched her hand. The girl's eyes were wide, terrified, staring at me in the doorway. The man wore a loose t-shirt and jeans, face wet with tires. There was no weapon visible, only a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor, shattered glass beneath. The remainder of the whiskey had pooled on the carpet, sticky and dark. He looked at me with the same hollow gaze I'd seen in the past, but this time it felt deeper, like he'd been waiting. I dropped the ram and raised my palms in a gesture of calm. "Sir, let's talk. I need you to stand up slowly." His breathing was ragged, sobbing. She found me," he stuttered, eyes darting between me and his daughter. "She found me in the kitchen, crying. I didn't know what to do." His voice cracked, a mix of regret and terror. "I didn't want her to see me like this." I kept my tone steady. "Sir, put the bottle down. Let's get your daughter out of here." He slowly placed the whiskey bottle on a nearby box, then turned and gently placed the girl onto the carpet. She sat rigid, clutching her quilt, looking at me with a blend of fear and curiosity. I knelt and offered a small smile. "Hey there, your daddy's okay. I want you to stay right here and not move until I tell you." She nodded once, tears glinting on her cheeks. I nodded back. I turned my focus to her father. He was trembling, eyes sunken. I recognized that look, the weight of mistakes he couldn't undo. "Sir, drop to your knees. Cross your wrists in front of you. Keep your eyes down." He complied, sinking onto his knees, head bowed. I stepped in, secured his wrists behind his back with cuffs. He winced as the metal clicked around his wrists. He looked at me then, eyes pleading. "I never meant." He trailed off. I rose, radio pressed to my shoulder. "Dispatch, 1 suspect in custody. No weapons besides the broken bottle. One juvenile inside. Secure her with EMS. I backed out of the room, keeping my gaze on the child. A paramedic in turnout gear filed in quietly and knelt beside her, offering a gentle smile. The little girl wiped her nose and edged behind him. I felt my chest tighten, relief mixed with sorrow. This wasn't the same as the last time I saw a child in one of these apartments. This one would walk out alive. But would she ever be the same? Would the smell of whiskey and broken glass follow her nights? My jaw clenched. I turned and led the suspect out of the apartment, down the hallway, and onto the stretcher they'd wheeled in. People watched from the staircase landing, a few tenants peering out, dread etched on their faces. I heard one whisper, "That's the guy who lives next door." I didn't linger. Outside, sunlight filtered through overhanging vines, illuminating the lot. Officers buzzed around, securing evidence, a half-empty whiskey bottle, a broken wine glass, the girl's quilt folded with care. EMS loaded her into the ambulance, her father strapped to a gurney, head hanging. I stayed at the edge of the curb, legs spread, arms crossed, watching them drive off. Hernandez approached, her face tight. "Thanks for backup." I nodded. "Make sure they get a psychologist for that kid." She met my gaze, nodded again. We both knew that Mom would need more than Band-Aids to fix what was broken. I limped to my cruiser, the pavement slick beneath my boots. Each step jarred my bones. I thought of my own daughter, how I'd hugged her last night before, drifting in and out of a half-sleep. I told her a bedtime story. Even as I walked here, I'd pictured her snug beneath her covers. Now, I wondered if my daughter would ever be safe from the noise in my mind. The echo of that toddler in 3B, the flashbang disorientation, the father's scream. This time, the little girl would survive. Just another day. But would she ever feel safe in her own home again? I slid into the driver's seat, radio in hand. "All units clear," I said. Dispatch gave me the usual, rosters, traffic around the city. I didn't respond further. I stared out the windshield at the tenants re-entering their apartments. I tried to recall how it felt to be normal, if I ever had that feeling. My fingers tapped against my thigh in time with my heartbeat, a low, relentless drum. The day dragged on with routine reports, meeting with detectives, debriefing with the lieutenant. Notes taken, forms filled, each scribble a reminder of the day's events. My arm throbbed every time I reached for my pen. I watched the clock tick toward mid-afternoon when my shift would end. I longed for home, for escape, but the thought felt distant as that toddler's final stare. The lieutenant clapped me on the shoulder as I was about to leave. "You did solid work today," he said. I managed a nod, my face neutral. He parted, and I gathered my gear. When I finally walked out of the station, dusk was settling in. The sky bloomed with orange and purple. I climbed into my cruiser and stared at the clouds, letting the engine run. I needed to gather the pieces of myself. I closed my eyes, the lullaby, soft, distant, twined with the chirp of crickets beyond the station's walls. It lingered, a bitter echo of what came before. I pressed my palm to the steering wheel, tasted sweat on my lips. I drove until the streetlights flickered on and the world darkened. I parked on a bridge overlooking the river, a stretch of water I'd known since training days. Misted reflections of neon signs and headlights danced on the black surface. I shut off the engine, but didn't open the door. I just sat, feet on the brake, hands wrapped around my good knee. I listened to the distant hum of traffic, the churn of water below. My heart thundered so loudly I thought it might break free. I remembered that toddler earlier today, the way she clung to her quilt, wide-eyed, silent. I remembered the child from 3B years ago, her death, parents' wails, memories stacked in layers, coffee-stained photos too painful to sort. I felt the weight of every decision I'd made, the angle of my shield, the flash of the muzzle, the moment I prayed she wouldn't be there. The child's life saved today was a fragile triumph, but it carried the same shadow I'd carried since that first mission. I recognized a pattern. In that moment, saving one life hadn't erased the million I couldn't save. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my uniform riding up and brushing against the brace. I opened the door and stepped out, letting the cool air whip around me. The sound of my boots on metal was the only noise for a moment. I approached the railing and leaned forward, forearm aching where the plates and screws lay beneath my skin. Below me, the river surged, cold, indifferent. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. The oily taste of fear and guilt drifted at the back of my throat. In the distance, I could hear the faint scream of a siren, the wail rising and falling like a lament. I imagined that siren call, a parent in danger, a child in need. I imagined re-entering that apartment, door slamming against my shields, yet again. I felt the sting in my arm intensify as if demanding I never forget. I approached the railing further, toes hovering on the edge. The wind tugged at my uniform as though urging me to step back. But I stayed, kneeling on one knee, my arm throbbing. I looked out at the river, at the shifting reflections of neon lights. For a long time I just watched the water, black and chanting. I could feel a tremor in my chest, the remnant of grief so old I thought it might harden like scar tissue. But sitting there, I felt something shift. Acceptance of my inability to save everyone. The realization that every call carried the same cruel stakes, life or death, guilt or relief. I straightened, pressed both palms onto the cold metal railing, and let the night air cool my face. A single thought edged into my consciousness. This river didn't judge, didn't mourn. It simply carried every fallen leaf, every overheard scream downstream. I didn't have to be its keeper. I rose, drawing back from the edge. I would continue to answer the call, but I'd carry this night with me differently. I'd let the river, unchained, relentless, wash some of the dread into its depths while I carried on. I turned away from the river and headed back to my cruiser. My breath steadied, the hollow ache in my chest settling into a dull throb. I realized I'd never forget what I'd seen or done, but for the first time, I felt the faint possibility of standing again, unbroken enough to face tomorrow. I climbed into the driver's seat. I placed my hand on the steering wheel and exhaled. A low, steady release. The siren in the distance faded as I started the engine and pulled away. As I drove back toward Elmwood Heights, the lullaby remained a faint pulse behind my thoughts, but I no longer felt its sting as sharply. I would never unhear it, but I would bear it without letting it define me entirely. And as the city lights washed past my window, I understood that this steady hum of life, the relentless flow of darkness and light, was all the world would ever offer. I would navigate it, step by step, call by call, until the chain of memories found its place. I would answer the call. And that thought, quiet, determined, was the only promise I needed to keep. I merged onto Elmwood Heights Drive just as the last glow of traffic lights winked out. The complex loomed ahead, its windows flickering with lives resuming after dinner, families settling in, lights turning on one by one. I eased the cruiser into a spot behind the same battered sedan that had marked our entry days ago. My stomach tightened at the familiarity of it. I remembered how the rain had slicked that pavement the first time. how my boots had clanked against the asphalt before I climbed into that building. Now, the world seemed daylight bright, deceptively calm after everything that had transpired. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, hands resting on the cool rim of the steering wheel, fingers tracing the worn leather. In the rearview mirror, I pinned my gaze to the row of elevators leading to the third floor. My heart thudded, reminding me that I would soon have to face those stairwells again. Not as a SWAT team stacking up, but as a lone patrol sergeant returning to the scene for a follow-up assignment. My arm ached beneath its brace, each pulse of pain a reminder that what I'd done had exacted a cost I could never fully reimburse. I exhaled softly and flicked off the engine. The hum died, leaving only my breath and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. I slid out, reaching to lock the door, with the key fob, so I wouldn't have to grip the cold metal handle. The click of the locks echoed in the empty lot, a small punctuation against the hum of mid-evening cicadas. I tucked my hands into my pockets, feeling the weight of my gun belt at my waist, a comfort now more than a burden. Each step toward the building felt like a heartbeat in motion, slow, deliberate, unwilling to betray any hint of the storm that churned beneath my calm exterior. Inside the lobby, fluorescent bulbs glowed with the same harsh intensity as before. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, looked up from her clipboard as I passed. "Sergeant Reyes," she greeted without warmth. She had no idea who I was or why I was here, just that I was uniformed authority returning to the premises. I gave a brief nod and headed for the elevator. The door slid open to reveal our Destiny lift, and I stepped in alongside a delivery man wheeling in a cart of cardboard boxes. The smell of cardboard mingled with the faint scent of urine and damp. I pressed the call button for the third floor. When the doors closed, the corridor beyond was quiet. I flicked on my flashlight with one hand, its beam refracting off scuff marks on the cinder block walls. Each step echoed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then the faint slamming of the elevator doors closing behind me. I put my flashlight back to low beam, revealing peeling paint emblazoned with graffiti ghosts, faded tags no one bothered to repaint over. The air was heavy with a musty indoctrination of neglect. I spotted the numbered doors, 3A, 3B, 3C, 3D. My boots made soft thuds against the dull linoleum as I approached 3B's threshold. I paused at the door, running a gloved finger along the warped wood. There was no lock to pick this time, no need to batter it open. Instead, I knocked quietly, 3 short raps, just enough to announce my presence. I heard nothing from within. I pressed my hand to the doorknob. It turned easily. The door swung open on its own weight, creaking as though reluctant to reveal itself again. I shone my flashlight into the apartment. Everything was exactly as I remembered, except now there were no bodies, no bloodstains, only empty absence. The coffee table stood crooked, the leg still splintered in one corner. Still, the place had been swept clean. Someone had come through with disinfectant and bleach to scrub away every trace. The toys were gone. The toddler's quilt was gone. The stench of horror had been erased, or so someone thought. I inhaled the stagnant air, no longer thick with trauma, but still heavy with echoes. My eyes tracked the living room, a tattered couch pushed against the window, the kitchen opening dim behind it. Every tile creak would have once signaled a step closer to death. Now, nothing moved. I stepped inside, boots crossing the threshold into a theater where nothing was happening. Yet my stomach burned with anticipation. My flashlight's beam swept the walls, holes where hideaway security cameras once hung, plaster patched over. I went deeper, moving past the couch toward the hallway. The flicker of an overhead bulb greeted me. The same bulb, I thought, but perhaps replaced. Its sputter reminded me of how light had clashed with darkness here, illuminating only enough to keep you on edge. My arm throbbed. I grasped the brace beneath my coat to steady myself. Each breath tasted like the coppery aftertaste of childhood panic. I reached the spot where that little boy had sat a lifetime ago, the 2-year-old frozen in terror, the echo of his final breath still haunting the edges of my memory. The place was empty now. The quiet strangled me, pressing into my chest and refusing to let go. My chest tightened. I forced myself to take a step further into the kitchen. The smooth surfaces gleamed sterile, lacking the sticky sheen I'd stepped through. The sink was empty, no vials of painkillers beneath it, only a blank cabinet door. I left 3B, blinking against the artificial glare, and moved to the stairwell. Each step down felt like a descent into memory. I counted methodically, 1, 2, 3, hoping that counting might tether me to the present. The beam from my flashlight rattled across the walls, illuminating framed notices. Rules about leashed pets. No loud music after 10 p.m. Management's contact number in case of emergencies. I remembered how that night, the only emergency that mattered was the sinister symphony of a child's cry, a father's gunshot, and the helpless hush that followed. At the landing between the second and third floors, I paused. Behind me, the darkened corridor of 3B stretched away. In front of me, the stairwell ascended to the top floor, 4A, 4B, and so on. I shone my light into the gloom. Shadows coalesced in corners, forming shapes I'd sworn I saw that night. A crouched figure behind a broken chair, a child reaching for me through the haze. I swallowed. I had to prove to myself that it didn't exist anymore, that I could step away and leave it behind. I closed the stairwell door behind me, my hand lingering on the cold metal handle, a boundary between then and now. I descended the spiral of stairs to the ground floor. The hum of the foyer's air conditioner drowned out the footsteps of my boots. At the first floor landing, a young mother hurried down with a stroller in tow, a toddler's laughter trailing behind her. They passed without noticing me. My breath caught. I watched the mother smiling, the child unaware of the world's terrors, just as the girl in 3D had been. A wave of something unfamiliar washed over me, sorrow laced with fierce protectiveness. I could have sworn the shadow of that girl in 3D lurked behind the mother's legs, checking her path with wide, knowing eyes. I stepped onto the tiled lobby floor. The security desk was empty, but the youngest of the building's maintenance staff peeked out, holding a clipboard. He recognized my uniform and shut the clipboard with a snap. "Sergeant Reyes," he said, voice small, deferential. "Is everything okay?" He gestured toward my arm. I nodded curtly and walked by without responding. I could sense his curiosity or pity, whichever it was. I didn't have energy to explain. Not now. I climbed back into my cruiser and drove home in darkness, the streetlights flickering on like distant beacons. My reflection in the rearview mirror was ghostly, eyes rimmed with red, uniform rumpled, arm bandaged beneath the sleeve. The hush of the city wrapped around me, but it didn't calm me. Instead, I felt every inch of my body bristle with recollection. In the driver's seat, I laced my fingers around the steering wheel, gripping it tight enough that my knuckles turned white. I realized I was still searching for something, closure maybe, or absolution, but both felt impossible now. I exhaled, letting the air shudder out of me in one long gust. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had deepened to an inky black, speckled with the city's suburban glow. My wife's car was not there. She must have taken my daughter out for errands after dinner. I hesitated before the front door, flashlight in hand, arm weighted with fatigue. I set the light on the porch rail and fumbled at my belt, removing the holster, sliding off my duty belt and placing it on a chair by the door. The click of the buckle felt louder than I expected. I wondered if it would be the same tomorrow, or if I would grow accustomed to returning without the weight of a uniform's authority. Inside, the house was quiet. No television hum, no laughter. I set my flashlight in the hallway, step by step, feeling my muscles loosen as I moved away from the rigors of my shift. Everything smelled of lavender air freshener and old hardwood floors. I left my uniform top draped over the coat rack by the foyer, careful not to tangle the zipper on my brace. The dining room light was dim. The table was set for one. A bowl of cold spaghetti, a half-drunk glass of water, and a folded napkin with a fork atop. A note stuck on the refrigerator read, "Gone to pick up Anna. Be home soon, love Kay." My chest tightened. I stared at the note for a long moment, then exhaled and slipped into the living room. I sank onto the couch, placing my good hand palm up on my thigh, as though waiting for the missing piece of myself to return. Outside, tires squealed as my wife's car rolled into the driveway. My daughter's giggle drifted through the screen door. Relief rippled through me so strong it left me breathless. Minutes later, they bounded in, my wife's face bright with a warm tiredness, my daughter's eyes shining with unspent energy. "Hi, Daddy," my daughter squealed, running to me. I scooped her up in one arm, careful to support my injured side. Her weight felt familiar, but the agony in my arm reminded me I wasn't the same father she used to know. Still, I held her close, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, cotton candy mixed with shampoo, and for an instant the weight in me lifted. She giggled and kicked her legs, as though trying to shake out the energy she'd bottled all day. I smiled, and for a second, her innocence sheltered me. My wife came in behind us, dropping her purse on the side table. She saw my rigid posture and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. "How are you feeling?" she asked, voice low. I braced myself against the couch cushion. "I'm okay," I lied, though the simplest truth felt impossible. My daughter looked up, eyes wide, and said, "Daddy, tell me that story about the puppy and the fire truck." My heart ached, but I knew I had to say yes. I picked her up again, my good arm cradling her. I kissed the top of her head, brushing loose curls aside. "Sure," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound gentle and unburdened. I set her on my lap, adjusting so she faced me. She settled in, chin resting on her knee, eyes expectant. I inhaled deeply, gathering my thoughts. I pictured a world far removed, from Elmwood Heights. A world where a puppy befriended a fire truck to save a kitten from a tree. The words formed slowly in my mind, and I began, "Once upon a time, there was a scrappy little puppy named Scout." My daughter's eyes drifted shut as I launched into the story, and I felt her small hand rest against my chest, the steady beat of her heart matching my own. As I spoke, I watched the golden lamplight play across her face, illuminating every fine lash and soft curve of her cheek. My wife settled beside us, leaning her head against my shoulder. The story's melody flowed from my lips, an act of creation meant to buffer any remnants of dread. And yet, even as I described Scout's playful antics and the clanging of the fire truck's bell, something in me remained tethered to the memories waiting in 3B's hallway, an awareness that innocence was fragile, and that no story I told could fully shield my daughter from life's shadows. When I finished the tale, my daughter yawned, heavy-lidded and content. My wife took her from my lap and carried her upstairs, humming a low lullaby. I remained on the couch, staring at the point where shadows met light across the living room floor. The house's silence felt safe, but it was a fragile thing. A thin veneer stretched across the turmoil beneath. I looked at the unlit hallway leading to the bedrooms. A weight settled in my chest, the understanding that darkness was never fully banished. It simply lurked until the light faded. I rose and followed the stairs upward, pausing outside my daughter's door. I watched my wife lay her down, the soft rise and fall of their breathing a balm. My daughter's face, relaxed in sleep, reminded me what I was fighting for. I pressed my hand against the doorframe, closing my eyes and feeling the tender pulse of her sleeping warmth. I whispered into the quiet, "I will always protect you." I couldn't promise to save her from every threat, but I vowed to face them so she wouldn't have to. Turning away, I descended the stairs and made my way to the study, a small room at the end of the hall lined with bookshelves. I flipped on the desk lamp. On top of the desk lay a stack of manila folders, paperwork I'd set aside after my SWAT debrief. Incident reports, PG charts, mental health referrals, all evidence of the world I inhabited. I sat and ran a hand over the top folder, Case 140-3B, Homicide, Child Victim. I had never opened it. It seemed cruel to reopen what I had, by intention, sealed away. Yet, I needed to face it, to integrate it into the same life that encompassed bedtime stories and bedtime kisses. My fingers unfastened the metal clip at the top. I lifted the document and unfolded its pages, revealing typed statements, crime scene photos, and lab analyses. My eyes lingered on a picture of the bullet's trajectory, a close shot of the shattered revolver, a photograph of that father's face frozen in mid-scream, eyes wide with regret. I couldn't look away. Each image stabbed into me, yet I realized I no longer shrank from it. Once, I might have slammed the file shut and hidden it in a locker forever. But tonight I didn't. I flipped to the victim's statement. Terse lines describing the child's age, final injuries, estimated time of death. No mention of the father's grief, no context of the SWAT breach. Just data. I exhaled, pressing my palm to my forehead. The sterile words masked the collapse of that world. I realized then that I had spent weeks evading the horror, trying to outrun any hint of it. But evasion, I understood now, served no one. The darkness was part of my story, as much as Scout in the fire truck was part of my daughter's. I closed the folder and placed it back on the desk. I turned off the lamp, letting the study sink into darkness. On the corner of the desk, a small framed photo captured my wife and daughter smiling in the spring sunlight, my arm around them, all of us alive and unscarred. I picked it up and kissed the glass where my daughter's face beamed. I whispered, "I promise." It was the most honest vow I could make. I carried the picture to the hallway and paused outside my bedroom door. I pressed it to my chest, heart pounding. Inside, the world waited. Uniform tops hung on hangers, boots lined by the closet, a brace propped on the dresser. I opened the door slowly, stepping inside so that my feet landed on the rug we'd bought together, soft and neutral, a quiet oasis from the darkness. I set the photograph on the bedside table, where a lamp glowed softly. I climbed into bed, careful to align my arm in the brace so it didn't cramp. I felt the cool sheets against my skin, the gentle rise and fall of my own breath. Outside, traffic hummed faintly, a lullaby in its own right. Tonight, I felt a fragile peace. The memories of that apartment, of the father's final scream and the toddler's bloodstain were still with me, etched into every nerve. But I was here, with my daughter sleeping safely, upstairs with my wife beside me, our breaths in sync. For the first time since that mission, I didn't feel torn in half by what I'd done and what I'd saved. I closed my eyes and allowed my thoughts to settle on that promise. I would protect her from the darkness, or stand between it and her, even if it meant carrying that burden for the rest of my life. The ache in my arm throbbing through the brace, the echo of that lullaby, and the image of that empty hallway. They would always live with me. But not tonight. Tonight I would rest in the fragile refuge of home, knowing I had faced what had haunted me and remained standing. The night the call came in, I was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the grainy grain from my helmet cam playback. The clock by the squad room door read 00:58. Far too early for any real action to unfold. My name is Sergeant Alex Mercer, veteran of Delta Company's SWAT team in North Colorado County. I've been on hundreds of entries, and I've learned that there's a fragile moment, a razor-thin sliver of time just before the breach when everything is still unknown and undeniably dangerous. In that moment, you're balancing on a knife edge. You can feel the weight of your gear, the fatigue in your knees, the tension in your breath. It's in those seconds that your training flickers like a memory, and you realize that no matter how many times you run the drills, you can't truly prepare for what's on the other side of that door. I wasn't expecting anything tonight. Our shift was supposed to be routine. Just a few paperwork checks, spot patrol, and making sure the city's quiet blocks stayed quiet. Just after 1:02 a.m., our radios flickered to life with a call-out for a possible barricade situation at an aging, low-income apartment complex on Tanager Street, just off the interstate. Patrol had attempted contact with 2B, a middle-aged tenant named Sergio Alvarez, recently divorced, known to neighbors as quiet, reserved. They'd heard a gunshot earlier from inside the apartment. Now, Sergeant Johnson's voice crackled through my earpiece. SWAT, respond to 2B, Tanager Street Apartments. Possible barricade, suspect barricaded. No hostages confirmed, but unknown presence of minor child. Proceed with caution. Entry is priority if negotiator can't establish communication within 20 minutes. I could taste the metallic tang of my own saliva. My hand went to the patch on my vest that read Delta 1 for team leader, and I pinched it between gloved fingers. We'd drilled for years on hostage rescue and route and roll entries, but every true test came without warning. I stood, rolling off the cafeteria stool, muscles stiff from sitting too long. Two of my guys, Corporal Martinez and Corporal Reynolds, were already geared up and leaning against the lockers, checking weapon slings. Their expressions were flat. That flat-out look means one thing: someone's about to die if we don't do this right. I strapped on my helmet, its interior padding cold against my scalp. Martinez curled a finger at me, indicating the ballistic breacher's shotgun under his arm, loaded with double-aught buck for close quarters breaching. Not lethal rounds, but whatever came next would put us at inches from the suspect. The wall clock ticked to 1:05 a.m., and I felt that familiar drumbeat starting in my chest, a slow-building thunderstorm of adrenaline. Without a word, I nodded to the rest of the team and we filed out the door. Outside, the air was crisp enough that my breath puffed in white wisps under the fluorescent lights of the station's entrance. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving deep puddles and low spots of asphalt that gleamed like dark mirrors under our headlights. My SUV's siren was dead silent. We disabled everything except the radio to keep our approach clandestine. Corporal Reynolds took the wheel, headlights off. We moved along wet streets toward Tanager. I monitored the intersection of East Main and Lee, scanning for any stray vehicles or civilians who might wander into our path. It was 1:07 a.m., and the world felt colder, darker than usual. Even that single street lamp flickering down the block seemed to cast more shadow than light. Before we'd left, I had toggled my helmet cam on the record setting, knowing full well that every move we made would be scrutinized later. Not for discipline necessarily, but to reconstruct the events if things went sideways. I ran a mental checklist: flashlight charged, comms channel clear, medic on standby, route to exit planned, gear set to level 3A protection. Weapons were all set on less lethal ready. Breacher's shotgun with beanbags and sponge rounds, my pistol at hammer down. The rifle, my custom CRSQ-6 carbine, slung in low ready, bolt forward, round chambered. Ballistic goggles over my Gene 3 helmet. Isolation insoles in my boots for quiet steps. Every last detail burned indelibly into muscle memory, but that didn't stop my heart from picking up pace. We arrived at the Tanager Street Apartments at 1:11 a.m. A two-story complex built in the late 60s. Faded brick facade, fire escapes that looked rusted through, windows unevenly lit. Some were dark, others glowed pale yellow, as if someone dozed with the lights on. A lingering scent of mildew floated in the air, mixing with oil fumes from idling cars in the parking lot. We parked about 50 feet from the entrance. Engines off, radios muted. In the glint of my helmet lamp, I saw faint silhouettes of tenants watching from their windows, curtains rustling like skin in a breeze. Their faces registered unease. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how wrong. Our medic, Lieutenant Sanford, blocked the main pathway in his unmarked SUV, headlights on. His door was ajar, gear visible on the back seat, trauma kit, chest seals, tourniquets. He gave me a curt nod and a thumbs up. I nodded back. He'd be our immediate medical backup once we were through the front door. Corporal Garcia crouched behind me at the rear passenger door, checking live feed on his portable comm device, confirming the brief intel that Alvarez had gone dark on negotiations. Martinez tapped the side of his helmet. No, 3424 replies. That was code for no communication from the other side. We knew what that meant. I clipped off my external mic's mute and whispered into the radio. Delta 1 to command, on scene Tanager Street, 02-12. Possible minor inside, suspect sound barricaded, no direct contact. Recommend K9 hold if available, but no tactical K9 tonight. It was a calculated gamble. The K9 handler was on vacation. We'd have to trust our senses. I glanced at my team. 7 of us total, including 2-point breachers, 2 stackers, a rear guard, and Martinez as breacher. Everyone was quiet. We had practiced this routine so many times that our silence spoke volumes. Conviction, fear, or maybe a kind of resigned dread. At 1:13 a.m., I whispered, "Move up." We stepped off in formation, point man, corporal. Reynolds, with my rifle at the ready, barrel tight under my chin, thumb indexing the safety. I was right behind him, glancing at the tactical breacher's posture, ready for the door to come off its hinges. Martinez and Garcia flanked us, ready to support or arrest. The remainder stayed in stack formation, eyes scanning every inch of the hallway. The main door to the building was unlocked. Someone must have buzzed us in, or maybe it was broken. I didn't care. We entered the dimly lit foyer in near silence. The lobby was smaller than I remembered. White tile floor with chips revealing gray cement beneath. 2 stained couches sagging under nothing but their own weight. An antiquated payphone dangling by its cord. A flickering fluorescent tube sputtered overhead, casting stark shadows. Pipes ran along the ceiling like exposed veins. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale urine. I felt the claustrophobia squeeze my lungs. Once inside, I made eye contact with Garcia. He tapped twice on the low section of the wooden frame door to 2B, Alvarez's apartment. 2 knocks and a pause, 1 knock. No response. I signaled Martinez to attach the Halligan tool to the heavy door handle. We assumed the latch was solid, no way to tell if he'd locked it. I signaled our point man. Ready. Roughly 1:15 a.m. The team braced for breach. I placed my hand on the cold steel of the door. My glove wore thin lines of sweat under its fabric. The Halligan's forked end glinted under the console light. I felt the vibration of my own heartbeat through the tool shaft. We'd designated the southeast entrance, common entry for maintenance staff, so the main corridor would be controlled by 2B's doorway. I slid the fork under the door's metal lip and pried. The latch popped out with a whisper of stress, almost like the door didn't want to open. I gave a subtle nod to Martinez. 3-man stack, I whispered. On 3, I would kick directly to the latch area, while Martinez's flashbang would clear the initial interior corridor. 1, 2, 3. My boot connected with the door, sending splinters flying. There was a brief moment of resistance, like the magnets on a refrigerator door, and then it splintered inward. Martinez's flashbang sailed through with a thin hiss, arcing off the jamb before it detonated with a deafening concussion. For a fraction of a second, we were submerged in white noise and blinding light. My helmet cam registered the burst, the staggering afterimage of strobe. I stormed through, weapon high, scanning left to right. The corridor inside was narrow, carpet frayed, wallpaper peeling in curling strips, exposed conduit dangling like torn entrails. I heard the suspect's daughter crying from around the corner, a wet, mournful sob. Instinct peeled me off the path, but the wire mesh partition at the end forced me to turn left into the apartment interior. There, we found that tiny living room, linoleum floors splitting at the seams, a cheap folding table littered with half-empty cans of soda, a cheap TV with static crackling. A single overhead light bulb cast a sickly yellow glow. The suspect, Sergio Alvarez, crouched exactly where surveillance had predicted, behind a tattered green sofa pushed against the window. He had his AR-15 trained on us, muzzle level at our faces. His daughter, barely 6, stood frozen near the doorway, one hand pressed against her bleeding forehead. The moment my boots hit the carpet, I felt every second slow as if it were made of lead. The kid's lips trembled, her eyes wide like onyx marbles reflecting our helmet's lights. A bead of blood trickled from the fresh scrape on her forehead, pooling at her toes. "SWAT! Drop the weapon!" I roared, voice cracking against the echo of the flashbang. My rifle barrel was aligned so that if he even twitched, I could put a round between his eyes. But something in his expression held me back. The kid's sobbing echoed behind me like a metronome, each gasp punctuating hesitation. Alvarez's eyes flicked between me and his daughter, hot, primal terror bleeding into desperation. He rocked back, still clutching the rifle. "Stay back," he rasped. His voice wavered. "Stay back, or she dies." His words dripped with sorrow, not bravado. For a moment I doubted, was this a hostage-taker or a parent who'd lost his mind? He sounded like both. I caught Martinez's eye. He was ready with the breacher's shotgun, finger grazing the shell release. Garcia had his handgun trained just below my rifle, ready to shoot if I gave the order. 4 teammates huddled behind us, weapons raised, boots braced. The hallway was alive with tension so thick we could taste it, like copper on the tongue. I knew that if I hesitated another second, he might take that rifle off target, or worse, use his daughter as a shield. The approach we'd drilled: go loud, go fast, and break his focus. But this was different. The child was real. My throat tightened, and I suppressed a curse. 10 seconds passed, 20. My comm vibrated with a frantic whisper from Lieutenant Sanford down the hall. "Medic 1 approaching. Stand by." I subscribed to the policy: no shot until I had absolute confidence I wouldn't hit the child. Yet the kid's sobs grew more desperate, like they were ripping through skin. Straight lines of sweat traced her pale cheeks. Through the narrow gap between the sofa's armrest and the wall, I could see Austin, a 2-year veteran on my team, tensing at the holster, waiting for orders. I risked a glance at the TV stand. It wobbled, and I saw a lone Barbie doll toppling to the floor. In that second, I realized the razor's edge we stood on. Protect the innocent, stop the threat. Both seemed impossible. I took a breath, loose and shallow, cherishing the fact that I still could breathe. I keyed the mic. "Alvarez, listen carefully. We're going to get your daughter medical attention. Put your rifle on the ground, right now. She's hurt bad, but she can still live." His breath rattled in his throat. Somewhere behind me, Martinez ground the breacher's shotgun pump into battery. I could feel the familiar weight of lethal force next to me. My palm slickened. I repeated the order: "Drop the weapon." Each syllable deliberate, measured. No room for misinterpretation. The corridor felt smaller, closed in. The wallpaper pattern, a faded floral print, seemed to bubble, like it could tear away and swallow us. I felt a tremor in my knees, a second of vertigo. He hesitated. Blood dripped from the girl's forehead and pooled at her slippers. She ducked her head, moaning. He spoke again, voice low, thick with grief. I can't." He shook, as if the words were physical weights, dragging him down. I saw Austin shift his feet, ready to spring. Martinez's shoulder brushed mine, a silent agreement that we were seconds from breaching if needed. Then the girl screamed, a raw, keening wail that ruptured the silence. She stumbled backward, arms out, eyes locked on me. The rifle slipped from Alvarez's trembling grasp, clattering across the linoleum. But as it fell, he lurched forward, snatching his daughter's arm roughly. He dragged her behind the sofa again, his body shielding hers from our view. I snarled into the mic, "No move, SWAT, no move." But it was already too late. In that split second, Reynolds fired. The green tip round from his shotgun cracked through the room like thunder. I heard the ricochet off metal and the soft clack as it struck wood. Then the world went into slow motion. The muzzle blast illuminated the entire space with a dim orange glow. The kid's body jerked, and she collapsed in a heap. Blood erupted from her small chest like a grotesque fountain. She didn't cry out, only one short gasp before her eyes rolled back. The sofa arced over her like a tombstone. Reyes was suddenly on me, scrambling forward to pull me out of the doorway as another round from Martinez's AR blew a hole in the wall behind where Alvarez crouched. Debris rained down. I felt my legs fold under me as I tumbled backward, my rifle slipping from my grip. I hit the carpet hard, the impact knocking breath from my lungs, and I saw the kid's pale face, unmoving, staring at the ceiling. Then everything went black for a moment as I tried to fight panic rising in my chest. When I regained focus, the hallway was chaos. Smoke from the flashbang still hovered, dust motes floating in erratic shafts of flashlight. Sirens in the distance grew louder. I heard Lieutenant Sanford's med team storm in behind us. I found my knees, ripping off my vest to help stop the bleeding on the girl's chest. But there was nothing to salvage. She was gone. Alvarez lay curled on the linoleum, tears pooling in his eyes, staring at the spot where his daughter died. He was clutching the rifle's stock, oblivious to the blood trailing down his shirt. He wasn't cursing, screaming, or even begging. He just stared. I dropped to one knee next to him, heart pounding so loud I thought it might explode. I knelt on shards of peeling wallpaper, and for a second I saw the peeling layers as if they were flaking off my own soul. Somewhere behind me, the hallway's color shrank, and the walls caved in as if the building itself was mourning. I clenched my fist around fists, shaking so hard my helmet rattled. I thought I heard him whisper, "She was all I had." Then he closed his eyes. My vision tunneled as the adrenaline surged and crashed like waves. I wanted to scream at him for putting his kid in the harm's way, but I also wanted to hold him, to tell him I was sorry. I saw Martinez pointing his shotgun at me, his face pale but resolute. Then Lieutenant Sanford yanked me up and shoved me aside, pushing me out of the room so medics could work. I stumbled to the hallway, my boots squelching in the girl's blood that seeped out from the door crack. A bright, sticky river spreading across threadbare carpet. The walls shrieked in my ears, the silent screaming of peeling wallpaper as if it knew we had torn open something irreversible. Everything was still echoing. The crack of the shotgun, the crumble of diary pages we'd never see, the girl's final heart stutter. I went limp against the wall, my back against damp paint, and my helmet cam swiveled on my chest, capturing everything. I watched the kid's lifeless eyes on replay in my mind and felt the corridor shift around me. I felt something break inside, a fracture that would never heal. My world contracted to that single image, her tiny chest still, her eyes open in disbelief, as if some part of her was yelling, "Why didn't they save me?" At 1:18 a.m., I keyed my mic. Delta 1 to command. Shots fired, multiple casualties. Child struck, suspect down, officer down, need med evac, need crisis negotiator, need everything now. My voice was hollow, an echo of the officer I used to be. The moment I was shoved into the hallway, everything went into slow-motion blur. Footsteps pounded past me. Voices barked orders, but I felt suspended, trapped in a bubble where the walls of the corridor leaned inward, pressing on my skull. The smell of blood and flash powder and stale carpet coated every inch of my lungs. Beneath my helmet, my head felt like it was filled with broken glass. I watched from a distance as medics cradled the girl's limp body, her small frame strapped to a stretcher stained bright red. Lieutenant Sanford was kneeling beside her, shouting into his radio, "We need a code red to Mercy Trauma now. 2-year-old female, exsanguination to the chest." The EMTs tore through the door and vanished down the hallway, leaving me adrift amid gutted shards of yellowed plaster and that lingering echo of her last, breathless gasp. Somewhere behind me, Corporal. Reynolds cursed and kicked at the peeling wallpaper so hard that a chunk of plaster dislodged and clattered to the ground. He buried his face in his hands, jiggling with a silent tremor. Corporal Martinez, shotgun still raised, kicked the rifle from Alvarez's slack hands, driving a spatter of blood into the wood grain of the hallway wall. Even after the girl died, Martinez's expression betrayed confusion, like he couldn't process why we were still standing there. For a split second, I thought I saw tears in his hardened eyes. The beauty of perfect training is how quickly it dissolves in the face of real-life slaughter. When a stray 0-0 buck round slides across a veneer of carpet and punches out a life that was minutes away from survival. I felt Garcia's hand on my shoulder, a silent tether pulling me back into reality. His face was ashen. The harsh fluorescent light exaggerated every dark circle under his eyes. He whispered, "Sir, we need to secure the suspect." His voice was so soft I could barely register the words. I blinked, and the corridor snapped into focus. The goo of blood spreading across fine, gray threads of carpet. The drywall now marked with the smear of Martinez's boot. I looked at Alvarez, his face streaked with tears, his eyes hollow. He had a single bullet graze on his right shoulder, blood leaking through the sleeve of his gray hoodie. He was curled around his daughter's body as if she was the only warmth left in the world. I took a step forward, but my knees buckled. Memory and sound fractured. Everything slowed again as though the building itself was breathing, contracting and releasing around me. A musty odor rose from the linoleum, stale tobacco, bleach, and the cold tang of fear. The hallway light sputtered, flicked, and came back, as if mocking the fact that nothing in here could come back. I could feel my pulse in my temples like a pair of jackhammers. I swallowed bile. Blood trickled from my helmet's chin strap, but I didn't know where it came from. My head? My lip? I couldn't tell. "In the name of the law," I said through a clenched jaw, "put your hands where we can see them." My voice barely rose above a whisper, but it felt like an explosion in the corridor's hush. I watched him slowly uncoil, burying his face in his hands. His ribs moved with shallow, ragged breaths. I had a clear shot at his chest, see-through on my sights, but I didn't raise my weapon higher. I knew that if I flinched now, if I flinched even a fraction, I'd lose whatever fragments of a moral compass still hovered inside me. It was a calculated facade. No twitch, no unnecessary movement. The whole team was behind me now. Reynolds, Martinez, Torres, and the rest. Guns still leveled at Alvarez. None of them spoke, they just watched. I felt the heat of their stares through the barrier of my armor. Alvarez stood and stepped back, his knees wobbling. "Please, he choked out, his voice torn between anguish and resignation. He glanced at his daughter's body, now still as stone, and his shoulders shuddered. Then he sank to his knees, rifle clattering against his leg, and he pressed both palms to his face as he wept. I nodded to Corporal Torres. In a swift, practiced motion, Torres snapped on handcuffs around Alvarez's wrists. He didn't protest. His entire body sagged as if he had chosen to collapse rather than fight. As Torres hauled him up, Martinez holstered his shotgun, taking a moment to plant a foot on the discarded AR-15 so no one could reach it. Martinez's chest heaved like he'd run a mile. He shook his head as he resecured his weapon and turned away, unwilling to see Alvarez kneeling there, or the ghost of his daughter on the carpet. The rest of the team moved in to canvass the apartment, search for anything else that could be a threat. A hidden package, another loaded gun, an improvised explosive. But the real threat had traded barrel scars for tears. My world had already shattered behind that broken door. For a moment I looked down at Alvarez's blood-slicked boots. He was clutching the handcuffs, wrists raw beneath the cold steel. I wanted to apologize, but no words were possible. There was only silence. Lieutenant Sanford appeared at the edge of the doorway with my assault pack, lifting my rifle off the floor and clipping it back to my vest. He gave me a sharp nod as medics wheeled the girl's stretcher by, flanked by uniformed patrol officers who'd shown up as reinforcements. He leaned in, voice tight. "Mercer, we got reporting party on level 3 who says he saw movement near 3D. Unit wants a look." I took a shaky breath, the shortcut for "copy that," and swallowed a lump the size of my helmet. The weight of my rifle in my hands felt foreign, like someone handed me something I'd stolen and couldn't return. Martinez was already scanning level 3, spotlight cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. The rest of the team fanned out, checking each door, every lit window. The apartment building had 12 units, but as far as we knew, Only 2B was occupied in the middle of the night. Now, after the girl died, the whole building felt like a haunted mausoleum. Empty eyes staring from windows, doors that could conceal any shape of horror. I forced myself forward, knuckles white on my rifle's grip. As I passed Alvarez, I caught his eye, bloodshot, glazed with tears, and he whispered, "She was only 6. I didn't respond. I couldn't respond. Poised behind my visor and armor, I was a monster wrapped in blue and black. I had shot his daughter. I had let her die. The bullet that passed through her chest left a hole where her heartbeat used to be. And that hole echoed in my mind with a clang. The hallway to 3D was dim, lights out, no signs of habitation. Shadows pooled in every corner, making every step uncertain. I heard a door creak open behind me and turned to see Martinez's silhouette, his silhouette milling in the gloom. He tapped his radio. Nothing clear. All quiet on level 3. My reply was automatic. Copy. But my soul was screaming. I shook my head, trying to clear the image of the girl's tiny chest, her blank stare, and that half second where I could have changed everything. But I didn't change a thing. We swept through level 3 and found nothing but dusty furniture, flickering bulbs, a half-eaten pizza box on a stoop. A resident blearily opened the door to 3F, a knock fading into confusion when he saw a line of black-armored officers. He stumbled back and slammed the door shut, and we moved on. The building's layout was identical across floors. Narrow metal stairs, cement landings, doors spaced in predictable intervals. The cracked linoleum beneath our boots seemed noiseless, lined with decades of grime and small pools of condensation. Every time I passed a peephole, I half expected to see that same pair of eyes. My team, Alvarez, the girl. I wanted to be sure nothing else crawled out of those shadows. But there was nothing. No hidden accomplices, no secret lairs, no unexploded charges. Just the stale smell of mildew and hallway dust. The ghost of the girl was the only evidence that I carried in my bones. When we reached the bottom floor again, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The lobby felt colder now, as if the building's heartbeat had stopped. 10 feet from the front door, I paused and looked at my reflection in the tinted glass. My face was atlas-drawn in exhaustion. Sweat beaded along my hairline. A trickle of blood ran down my left temple, past my ear, down the back of my neck. I could still taste the copper on my tongue. My uniform was speckled with flecks of plaster and drywall dust. My patch, Delta 1, looked as though it belonged to someone else, a phantom SWAT leader. I thought about the command protocol that would follow. Sergeant Johnson would want a full after-action debrief. Timeline, ballistics, suspect statement, chain of custody for evidence. But in this moment, my only evidence was the image that replayed in my mind. The girl's chest, that tiny blossom of crimson bursting through her shirt, and her eyes, still open, frozen in her final moment of terror. My radio crackled to life. Mercer, command. Requested update. I keyed the mic, voice low and measured. Delta 1 to command. 2B cleared. Suspect in custody. 1 KIA, juvenile female. 1 apprehended, wounded. 1 officer wounded, minor. Everything felt hollow as I said it. The victim's name, her name was Emily Alvarez, was already recorded somewhere in a file. Entered into a system that processed children's lives as numbers on a screen. It didn't matter anymore. She was gone. When the front door finally swung open, cold night air rushed in and slapped me in the face. The parking lot's puddles reflected the broken halo of street lamps. A patrol officer near the cruiser saw me shuffle out and reached for his radio. Before he could speak, I caught his eye and gave a quick shake of my head, no words. He understood. The building behind me was hollow and still, no laughter, no alarms, just the low hum of an idle traffic signal on Main Street. I turned and walked away, letting the others handle evidence collection and suspect transport. I didn't want to see Alvarez on the gurney, flanked by 2 patrol officers looking like a prisoner of grief. I wanted to forget the way his shoulders had caved in when he realized he'd lost everything. But I couldn't shake the image. It chased me 2 blocks down the street. Her tiny body framed by that cheap linoleum, the way her head lolled to the side, eyes locked on the ceiling tiles. I paused at the corner, lights of my helmet cam still blinking red, recording. I looked back at the building, its windows like empty eye sockets shining a jaundiced glow. I felt as though I was staring into the tomb of some god we'd murdered. I wanted to go back in and knock every door until the echoes answered. But there was nothing left to do here. Nothing but face the fact that the policies I'd sworn to uphold had failed a 6-year-old. My legs felt like they were made of lead. Each footstep drove the shards of regret deeper into my gut. I reached down and unclipped my helmet, letting it thud onto the asphalt. My head felt too heavy. I placed a hand on a street sign, Tanager Street, my palm trembling. In that moment, the wind kicked up, tugging at my uniform and tallying through my hair. I watched Martinez lead the suspect away in handcuffs. Alvarez's shoulders stooped, head down, the weight of a dead child anchoring him. I could hear Reynolds' fractured breathing from behind me, and I knew he wasn't going anywhere until he processed what happened. I slumped to one knee, helmet in my lap, and stared at the mirrored circles on the pavement where the girl's blood had dripped through the building's cracks. Under me, the remnants of yellowed paint where someone had once scrawled "home" in sloppy block letters. The word felt cursed now. My comm crackled. "Mercer, you okay?" It was Johnson's voice, concerned, professional. I closed my eyes a second, stilling the rotation of images in my mind, the girl's empty eyes, the way her body sank, the darkness of the hallway peeling away at the edges. I didn't respond. Instead, I let the silence fill the radio channel, a silence so loud that I could hear nothing else. Finally, I let out a ragged breath and whispered, "I need a moment." There was nothing on the other end. I heard Johnson's intake of breath, as though he knew the words I couldn't say. I let my forehead rest against the street sign's metal, trying to anchor myself to something solid. I could feel the distant wail of a police siren rounding the corner, echoing off brick walls as though the city mourned with us. My eyes burned. The stars above were dim, obscured by low clouds drifting like restless shadows. Below me, the asphalt pulsed with the ghost of her heartbeat. Every drip of blood so pristine and final, as if someone had painted a perfect red stripe down the corridor to remind us what we'd done. A faint rustle of paper caught my attention, and I noticed a crumpled child's drawing at my boots. One of the kids from 3A must have drawn it. Scribbled stick figures under a yellow sun, the words, "I love Daddy," scrawled in crayon. Now it lay in a puddle of water and blood and was too wet to read. My stomach twisted as I picked it up. Taped underneath was a torn photograph of a smiling child next to an adult whose face was half cut from the frame. I glanced up at the building one last time, as though expecting to see Emily standing in a window, waving at me. But there was nothing there, just brick and shadows. I tucked the drawing and photo into my vest pocket, mementos of a life I couldn't save. I lifted my head, and the wind whispered through the streetlights. In that quiet, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. The uniform I wore would never feel like armor again. Instead, it would always chafe with memory and guilt. Gone was the crisp click of a flashbang meeting a doorframe. The hum of the radio would always carry a phantom echo of her last breath. The world beyond Tanager Street would spin on without us, but in those hours between 1:15 and 1:18 a.m., everything had stopped. For me, time fractured into before and after. Some doors open and never close. Some wounds never stop bleeding. I pressed the radio button one final time and sighed. Delta 1 to command, status update, moving back to station. My voice was a rasp, a ghost of steel for a man I used to be. I stepped off into the street, leaving behind the blood, leaving behind the girl, leaving behind that final moment where a child took her last breath. And as I walked away, I saw, in my mind's eye, her tiny handprint on the drywall, the glint of her tear in the yellow light. And I knew that I would carry that image with me until I died. The quiet devastation had seeped into my bones, like ink into water, staining everything I touched. No apology could reach her now, no protocol, no after-action, no fourth-quarter briefing would bring her back. All I had left was the memory of her empty eyes and the echo of that final, strangled breath. And when I closed my eyes at night, I still see her, translucent in the hallway light, waiting, asking, why? The walk back to the station felt endless. Every step I took on the wet pavement sent ripples through my bones, like the aftershocks of an earthquake I couldn't shut off. My boots sloshed through puddles rimmed with flickering yellow streetlights, and I imagined each puddle reflecting not just the lamp above, but the color of her blood, bright, dirty red, spreading outward until it stained the entire block. The air was thick and humid, pressing down on my lungs as though it wanted me to collapse. Somewhere, a siren wailed in the distance, but it sounded hollow, like it was echoing from inside someone else's chest. I didn't look back at Tanager Street Apartments. I didn't dare. Instead, I focused on the rhythmic thud of my chest, matching it to the click of my belt as I strode along, gear clinking with each step. My helmet was slung under my left arm, gloves still stained with her blood. I could feel the smudges, sticky, warm, impossibly heavy, like they were anchors, preventing me from moving forward. Traffic lights changed color. A lone taxi idled at a red light, its driver tapping at his phone, oblivious to me. I crossed without thinking, careful not to slip on wet asphalt and forget how to stand. The station was 2 blocks away, a squat brick building with fluorescent windows that glowed like eyes in the dark. I forced myself inside, triggering the door alarm. It shrieked briefly, and within moments, a patrol officer in a high-visibility vest emerged from the back office, eyes widening when he saw me. He swallowed and managed, "Sergeant Mercer? You okay?" I said nothing. The words were lodged in my throat, brittle fragments of guilt that I couldn't jam together. I just nodded toward the locker room. He gave me room, stepping back and pulling the door closed behind me. In that hallway, the fluorescent lights flickered like they too were second-guessing holding me up. Inside the locker room, the scent of damp uniforms and locker deodorizer felt oppressive. I headed to my locker without thinking, planted my helmet on the bench, and leaned forward, head in my hands. The world spun as if I'd been on a carousel spun by grief, each rotation slower than the last but more disorienting. My radio lay on the bench beside me, its plastic casing marred by scratches and a small smear of dried blood. I picked it up, felt its rigidity against my palm, and remembered pressing the button just before I left the scene, announcing that I was moving back to station. Every syllable of that transmission had felt like a betrayal, like I was turning my back on her body, leaving her to the cold hallways and a medical examiner who would list her as juvenile female, homicide. I exhaled and dropped the radio back onto the bench, its beeps and static lines registering in my brain as distant noise. I peeled off my vest and set it aside, the Velcro clasps squeaking in the emptiness. My uniform shirt was soaked in sweat, plastered to my chest. I unzipped it, feeling the cool air on my torso for the first time. Underneath, my heart still pounded, reverberating in my ribs like a jackhammer. I opened my locker and fished out a fresh shirt, too stiff, too clean. Every fiber felt alien against my skin. The new shirt's collar gaped, revealing a thin scar from some old training accident. I pulled it on and ripped off my blood-stained shirt quickly, folding it with methodical detachment. I stuffed it into a plastic evidence bag that I found inside my vest pocket, leaving the far more meaningful stains to be logged and sealed as proof that we had failed a 6-year-old. The uniform shirt went into the hamper, though I doubted I'd ever launder or wear it again. I sat on the bench, head down. The locker room was empty, no one to witness me unraveling. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear voices. For a long moment, there was only the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant clink of metal lockers in the hallway as officers on the floor shifted their gear. My thoughts felt siloed, impossibly far away from reason. My mind replayed that corridor, videotaped in infinite loops, with her body illuminated by the harsh glow of fluorescence, the blood so bright it seemed unreal. Each replay was slightly different, like a morphing film reel I couldn't stop. Eventually, someone knocked on the door. "Mercer?" The voice was soft. Captain Ellis. He opened the door a crack, recognized my silhouette, and stepped in. His face was pale beneath the harsh locker room lights, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Mercer," he said again, voice hushed. "I need you in the conference room. We're conducting a preliminary debrief. According to command, all Delta One assets need to be accounted for. Reynolds is already there." He hesitated, as though waiting to see if I'd resist. I didn't respond. He gestured to the door. "Come on," he said. "We need your statement." I forced myself to stand, the bench creaking under my weight. I straightened the new shirt, squared my shoulders, and swallowed. Captain Ellis fell in beside me, imposing in his uniform, his rank insignia polished, his belt lined with gear. As we walked through the station's corridors, I felt an odd detachment, like I was watching myself move through someone else's body. Beneath me, my ripple of panic had calmed into a dull ache. We passed the roll call podium, an empty lectern in the center of the floor where officers usually gathered for briefings. Now, it sat forlorn, lights dimmed. I could see a couple of patrol officers at their desks, typing reports, heads down. Their eyes flicked toward me, curiosity in their gazes, but they said nothing. They knew. Everyone knew. A child was dead because we'd breached wrong, because we'd let a father's panic override caution. I felt their judgment in the way their shoulders tensed. I half expected them to call me out, but they couldn't articulate the blame. They'd keep it to themselves. Captain Ellis guided me down a short hallway to the conference room, a windowless space with perimeter lighting that buzzed and flickered, ancient gray paneling, and a long metal table ringed with folding chairs. Corporal Reynolds sat there, his eyes hollow, staring at the table like he was looking for answers etched into the wood grain. Next to him sat Corporal Martinez, head in hands, shoulders slumped. On the other side was Lieutenant Sanford, who had patched his uniform shirt back together, but still had a fresh bandage on his palm where he'd tried in vain to stop the bleeding on the girl's chest. My gaze flicked to each of them, registering their shock. Ellis closed the door behind me and pulled out a chair. "Sergeant Mercer, thank you for coming. Captain Ramirez from command will join us shortly. We need to confirm a timeline and collect your statements." He looked at me intently, waiting for me to begin. I nodded, sliding onto the chair. My palms were slick against the hard metal surface. Martinez squeezed Reynolds' arm as if searching for comfort. Lieutenant Sanford ran a gloved finger through his hair, staining the strands with blood. The gravity of the room pressed down on me like a vice. I realized then that I was the one expected to lead this debrief. My voice would shape their understanding of what happened. But in my mind, my words felt muted, inadequate, irretrievable. How could I piece together the events when the worst part wasn't the timeline, but the unscripted horror? I felt incapable, but I knew I had to speak. I cleared my throat and pulled my gaze up from the table. At 1:02 a.m., I was in the squad room when we got the call. SWAT response for suspected barricade in 2B, Tanager Street, possible miner inside. We mobilized at 1:05 and arrived on scene at 1:11. My voice was flat, mechanical. The words felt lifeless, meaning sucked out by the weight of what had come next. My teammates sat, attentive, but something about the room felt distant, like I was addressing echoes instead of faces. I went on, detailing every step: the approach, the breaching procedure, the flashbang. I described how I saw Alvarez's daughter in the corner, her small form trembling, her forehead bleeding. I described the way I hesitated on the threshold, the choice I had made to hold fire until I was sure she was out of the line of sight. I watched their faces, expecting horror, reproach, perhaps pity. Instead, I saw acquiescence, knowing that the system's calculus often tipped the scales toward tragedy in a split second. I recounted Alvarez dragging his daughter behind the sofa, his words pleading, his finger shaking on the trigger. I relived Reynolds' shot, how perfect it was, how dead on. I didn't say the part about seeing the kid's chest bloom red. Captain Ellis already knew that. It was in the initial report. We didn't need to dwell on the poetry of her death. But I did need to convey the raw core, that second when a father's fear and a protector's instinct collided, and the bullet found the wrong target. When I was done, I sat back, throat raw. My mouth tasted like ash. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't respectful silence. It had the tinge of disbelief, as if they were trying to reconcile my words with the reality of a dead child. Finally, Lieutenant Sanford spoke. "Sergeant, the girl was already on the floor when I got there. She was gone." I tried. His voice broke, and he straightened, pushing a hand through his short-cropped hair. He quieted as tears slipped down Martinez's cheeks, and Reynolds sank lower in his seat, turning his face away to hide his expression. Captain Ellis cleared his throat. "All right. We'll need written reports from everyone who was on scene. Forensic will collect the flashbang canister, shell casings, everything. Reynolds, Martinez, Torres, Garcia, you'll each give statements about your roles. Sergeant Mercer, we'll need you to stay on duty until this is finished. Take as long as you need, but Command wants this wrapped by 1700 hours. Any questions?" I opened my mouth, but only a whisper came out. "What happens to Alvarez?" Ellis gave me a tight nod. "He's under arrest for homicide. We'll process him after he's medically cleared for the graze wound. His bond will be revoked. We'll coordinate with the DA's office." "I'm sorry, Sergeant. I know there's nothing we can say right now that helps." My throat tightened, but I nodded. I understood everything he meant. The paperwork, the court dates, the cold pronouncement of homicide. None of it would bring a 6-year-old back. The justice system would convene. Lawyers would argue standards of negligence, mental health, good faith. They would weigh the father's despair against our split-second decisions. But none of it would fill the hollow where her heart once beat. We dismissed to our tasks. I gathered my things slowly, every movement heavy. Reynolds and Martinez followed, exiting without a word. Lieutenant Sanford lingered, unfastening the bandage on his palm before tucking it into his vest. He shot me a look, sympathy mixed with self-reproach, before he strode out. I was left alone in the shrunken conference room, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as they always did when the tubes were nearing end of life. I slid back into my chair, head in hands, and let the hollow ache settle into my bones. The paperwork drudged on for hours. My statement bubbled up on the computer screen, typed words that felt like nails on a chalkboard. I struggled to describe what I felt when I saw her fall, because in that moment I felt everything and nothing. The autocue for witness statements demanded facts, time, coordinates, bullet trajectories, but none of that mattered compared to the final, excruciating flash. The last gasp of a child who couldn't outrun her father's fear or my rifle's sight. By 5 p.m., I had submitted the initial report. The station was quiet now, lights dimmed, officers filing out for briefings or leaving early to decompress. I waited for the forensics team to finish photographing the shell casings and sweep the girl's blood from the breach room. The cold sterility of lab-verified evidence left a sour taste in my mouth. Each bullet casing, each fragment of plaster, every smear of red was documented in triplicate. I stared at photographs of the scene. The girl's pool of blood a splotch of red that looked almost abstract in high resolution. I scribbled notes in a battered legal pad, trying to immortalize every detail, the way the flashbang's shell dented the window frame, the angle of the AR-15's barrel, the kid's sweaty hair plastered to her forehead. I needed to make sense of this, nail every fact to a wooden board so I could rationalize what felt irrational. Yet every note dug the hole in my chest deeper. By 7 p.m., I was still at my desk when I noticed the station lights flicker. A power surge must have hit. I fumbled for the desk lamp, unused for years, and flipped it on. Its dull glow illuminated a single photo perched on my locker. Me, in a freshly pressed uniform, grinning at the camera with my wife and 2 daughters on my left. They were bundled in jean jackets, blankets over their laps. That photo was from Easter 2 years ago. My wife's arm wrapped around my waist as I held our younger daughter's hand. Both girls beamed like I was some superhero. The irony made bile rise in my throat. My phone buzzed. My wife's name glowed on the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I couldn't speak to her. If I tried, I would break. I didn't know how to tell her I had killed a child. The notion made me retch in my mouth. I flipped off my desk lamp. The station emptied until I was alone with that photo, the blackness, and the hum of backup generators keeping the lights on. In the late hour, when I finally left the station, the world felt hollow. I met no one in the parking lot. Every cruiser was gone except the stationary perimeter units. The station's front doors locked behind me. I didn't bother rearming my radio. I folded it into my patrol bag and closed my locker, leaving my uniform inside. I took the elevator to the basement, eyes half closed as I navigated the dim hallway to the evidence locker. Inside the windowless vault, plastic bags of evidence hung from wire racks, the flashbang canister, the AR-15 magazine, a single spent shell from Reynolds's shotgun, and at the bottom, in an evidence bag sealed with red tape, was the small, blood-stained uniform shirt of the girl, her blood still visible along the seams. I stared at her name tag, Alvarez, printed in childlike script, and felt bile knot in my throat. I closed my eyes and heard the faint echo of her ragged breathing. Then I moved on, grabbing my own uniform shirt from the locker in the corner, marked Mercer, Alex, and dropped it in the locker where mine had been, now empty and cold. I took a detour through the squad garage to retrieve my car. Outside, the night was overcast, and a thin mist drifted across the hood of my cruiser. I climbed into the driver's seat, closed my eyes, and turned on the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, and I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Hollow eyes beneath heavy lids, a gaunt face framed by sweat-soaked hair. The uniformed officer in my reflection was a ghost, a phantom who waddled through procedures but had relinquished his soul hours ago. I backed out slowly, headlights slicing through the mist. I could still smell the girl's blood in my uniform, a tangy, coppery stain I couldn't wash off. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. Somewhere in that mist, a car passed, its headlights momentarily blinding me and dissolving into the darkness. I blinked and pressed the brake lightly, the sensation of the pedal like a guilt I couldn't escape. I punched the radio volume button, but no channels were active. There were no orders, no chatter, just static. In the stillness, I remembered the last words I heard her father whisper, his broken plea. She was only 6. The phrase ricocheted through my skull like a hammer. A child's life measured in years, hours, seconds, gone in a suburban hallway, beneath peeling wallpaper and that buzzing yellow bulb. To get home, I had to drive through a strip of town filled with bars and late-night diners. Most of them were closed or shuttered. One diner's neon sign flickered, open 24 hours, but the windows were dark. I wondered if anyone inside had a clue what I was carrying, what catastrophe I carried like a pebble sliding through my heart. I drove past row after row of square houses, their lawns neat, golf carts parked under carports, flags hanging limp from poles. I saw no signs of life. The world was asleep, and I was the walking dead. My house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, well kept and quiet, a brown brick rectangle with a porch light on softly. I parked across the street and sat, engine idling, for longer than I cared to admit. The night's events assaulted me like an endless looping tape. The flash, the gunshot, the girl's collapse, the man's weeping. My shoulders sagged. I felt like someone had cut the breath from my lungs. I didn't dare move. At some point, or maybe it was hours later, the engine died. The dashboard lights blinked off. Only the porch light remained, casting a pale glow on the front door. I sat there in the dark, not knowing if I had the strength to step out. I noticed something in the corner of my vision, a faint silhouette of a police cruiser parked down the block. Likely another officer checking in on me, verifying I got home. I didn't need them. I wasn't a normie needing support. I was the origin of the nightmare. I opened my door and stepped onto the grass. The dew was cold beneath my shoes, seeping through the soles into my feet. I trudged up the driveway, each step a summons from guilt. The front door was unlocked. My uniform shirt and vest lay discarded on the coffee table, half hanging off. I didn't pick them up. Instead, I climbed the stairs in silence, hearing the creak of floorboards beneath me like the building itself was groaning under regret. In the bedroom, my wife lay curled under blankets, breathing softly, oblivious to the storm inside me. My daughters were asleep in bunk beds in the next room, one on the top bunk, one below. Each rose-colored snooze protector on their faces made me ache. Their chests rose and fell with innocence. I didn't have the right to wake them, to force them into my horror. So I lingered in the doorway, the soft light from the hallway illuminating their faces like they were statues carved from marble, untouched by evil. I sank to the carpet, propping my back against the doorframe. My uniform shirt lay in a heap at my feet. I reached out and pressed a finger against the fabric, cold, synthetic fibers that still smelled like gun oil and sweat. I recalled the feel of the girl's blood on my gloves, the dampness of it, warm and final. I touched my cheek, brushed away a tear. My reflection in the bedroom's window looked distorted, smeared with a shadow I didn't recognize. For a long time, I stared at my sleeping children, memorizing their faces. One of them stirred, rolled over, but didn't wake. I felt something like fierce protectiveness ignite in me, a flame that wanted to shield them from the horrors of the world. But I knew that after tonight, I could never protect them from the nightmare I carried. My failure had shown me how quickly innocence could be torn away. I imagined a scenario, waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of glass breaking, footsteps on the porch. Would I be able to load my rifle and face down the threat and make the right choice? Or would I hesitate, replaying images of Tanager Street and that 6-year-old's empty eyes? I rose and crept to the dresser, rummaging for a bottle of water. The stillness of the house pressed on me. No hum of late-night television, no ticking of a clock. The only sound was my heart hammering so loudly I thought the walls would crack. I drank from a glass, the water cool in my mouth, and felt a tremor in my hand. My lips parted, tasting stale metal. I realized I hadn't brushed my teeth or showered since before the call. The grime of the day clung to me, blood, sweat, fear. I decided to shower. In the bathroom, the tiles under my bare feet were cold, unforgiving. I turned on the faucet, adjusting the temperature until steam rose. I stepped into the shower and let the water wash over me. At first, the water was too hot, scalding, but I let it run, scrubbing at my hair and arms with soap until the lather turned pink. I felt her blood run down the drain in thin rivulets. I scrubbed until my skin stung, until my fingertips pruned. The water running felt like it might wash away my guilt, but I knew it wouldn't. As I shampooed, I kept my eyes closed, envisioning the girl's face. Her hair plastered to her forehead in damp strands, her eyes staring at the ceiling tiles like they were strangers. I felt bile rose in my throat and gagged. The shampoo-slicked glass shower door fogged over. I reached out and tapped it, smudging a small circular hole in the condensation. Behind the glass, my reflection was ghost-like, eyes sunken, face gaunt, hair clinging in wet strands. I let the water fall harder, hoping it would drown the echo of her final breath. Until it was just me, alone in that cubic gray room, water pounding, the world blurred beyond the glass. I wondered if I could ever reclaim my soul from the wreckage I'd helped create. When I turned off the tap, the silence was deafening. Water dripped from my hair and chin, collecting at my feet. My knees buckled, and I sank to the tiled floor, sobbing like an animal in pain. Time lost its meaning. I sat there until the water pool evaporated and my uniform napkin soaked through, until my head buzzed with the memory of the breach. When I finally pulled myself to my feet, I felt hollow, as though the water had sucked something from me. I toweled off, each stroke scraping phantom blood from my skin. I donned a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, comfort colors, heather gray, and left the uniform hanging from a hook on the bathroom door. In front of the mirror, I peered at the man staring back. Refuse under his eyes, neck stiff, lips chapped. I ran a finger sideways below my left eye and felt a swollen lump. I'd been hit in the face, but I hadn't noticed the bruise until now. Healed or not, it served as a permanent bruise, proof of my entry, my mistake. I splashed cold water on my face and took a deep breath. I whispered to my reflection, "I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry." The words were weak, but they shattered something inside me. I didn't know if she could hear them. She was gone, gone forever, and my apology was too late. Later that night, though by then it was more like dawn, I crept back to bed. My wife stirred awake and looked at me with those big, warm eyes I loved. She opened her mouth to ask what had kept me so long, but I shook my head and planted a kiss on her forehead, pressing my face against her hair. She closed her eyes, settling back to sleep as if I were no more than a late husband returning from a long shift. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I lay on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the final scene in the corridor, the way her tiny body lay cooked into the linoleum, the way the blood pooled in a quiet, spreading stain that refused to be hidden. I thought about Alvarez, his grief so raw it broke the bones in my chest. I realized that I would never be able to salvage my innocence, that the uniform I wore would forever be tainted. The night's events would live inside me like a scar, raw and jagged. My wife shifted, her hand grazing mine. I closed my eyes, wishing for sleep, but instead I felt the first threads of nightmares winding through my mind. In my dreams, I saw the corridor again, but this time it stretched into an endless abyss, the roof caving in, wallpaper curling into monstrous shapes, the girl's lifeless eyes the only constancy. I woke gasping, heart racing, and I could still smell the flashbang's sulfur on my breath. At 4 a.m., I stumbled out of bed, unable to return to sleep. My body felt wired, but every muscle ached. I dressed in jeans and a worn jacket, my uniform jacket still carrying the Delta One patch, and stepped outside. The pre-dawn air was cool and quiet, the world holding its breath before the day began. The streetlights were dim, and the sky had the faintest hint of salmon on the horizon. I walked to the end of the driveway, my feet carrying me without conscious thought. Neighbors' houses were silent. No kids playing, no TVs flickering. Down the block, I saw the pair of patrol cruisers parked outside the station, empty and waiting. My reflection shimmered in their windshields as I passed. I lifted my chin and focused my gaze on the wavering line of houses ahead, my neighborhood, my safe zone. But I knew I could never feel safe again. The mask had slipped, and the horrors of my job had bled into my home life. Step by step, I walked to the cul-de-sac circle, where the street ended. Around me, the world was still, but I felt its weight bearing down on me. Every droplet of dew on the grass, every rustle of a loose shutter, every fractured thought in my mind. I realized I couldn't outrun what I'd done. I couldn't outrun myself. In the distance, a bird sang, a single chirp that cut through the darkness like a knife. I closed my eyes, letting the sound echo inside my skull. For a moment, I felt the warmth of the day yet to come, the promise of dawn, but it was a hollow hint, tainted by the knowledge that a 6-year-old's life had flickered out in the middle of the night. I opened my eyes and saw a single droplet of dew glistening on a blade of grass. It shimmered like a tear. I reached down and let it fall onto my palm, cold, clear, tiny. In that moment, I felt so small, so broken, that it seemed fitting. I thought of all the things I'd do differently, how I'd turn the door, kick a fraction later, how I'd swap the flashbang setting, how I'd see past his beard and his sweat and find that his fear was as real as mine. But I couldn't change what had already happened. I walked back toward the house, my reflection warped by the moonlight. The world was waking up. Birds, distant traffic, the clink of a garage door opening. I wondered if my neighbors would be celebrating their morning coffee, unaware that I carried a private apocalypse in my chest. I reached my front door and hesitated. I wanted to stay out here forever, linger in the darkness where my secrets felt safe. But the light was creeping through the living room curtains. My daughters would wake soon, hungry for breakfast, and full of questions about their day. I couldn't bring myself to be a father they could trust. Not anymore. I was the man who had killed a stranger's daughter. That truth would never wash off me. I opened the door and stepped inside. The house was still quiet. The smell of clean laundry lingered, fresh linens. The coffee maker on the countertop dripped stale grounds. I flicked the light switch, and the living room flooded with yellow light that felt too bright, too cruel. I stood in the center of the room, feeling exposed, and closed my eyes. In my mind, I saw that hallway again, blazing in strobe and smoke, and the girl looking at me with empty eyes that still asked, "Why?" The day's rising sun filtered through the curtains, and I realized I had to face it. The world wouldn't stop because of my loss. Floors would need vacuuming, dishes washed, kids driven to school. The curse of everyday life would press on as if nothing had happened. I took a deep breath, steeled my jaw, and walked to the kitchen. I poured a cup of coffee, black, bitter, too hot, just like I used to drink before this. I took a sip, and it scalded my tongue. I thought about how the chemical burn of a coffee was nothing compared to the burn in my soul. I set the mug down and stared at the photo on the fridge of my girls. 2 smiling faces framed by daisies. The words written in my wife's handwriting along the bottom read, "To our hero, Happy Father's Day." That had been a month ago. Now I wondered if I even deserved the label hero. I couldn't protect the vulnerable, couldn't protect anyone from the cruelty of a split-second decision. The shrill beep of the microwave snapped me back. My younger daughter's lunch container sat inside, waiting to be warmed. She'd be up any minute. I reheated the food, my hand shaking. The hum of the appliance seemed deafening now, a chorus of reminders that life pressed on. I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes. I needed to steel myself, to prepare a face that wouldn't betray the world I carried inside. When the microwave dinged, I retrieved the warm container and set it on the kitchen table. I walked to the bedroom, gently nudging my older daughter's shoulder and whispering her name. Her eyes opened, bright and curious. "Dad," she said sleepily, "did you sleep okay?" I paused, the question hanging in the morning air like acid. I swallowed and forced a smile, though it cracked inside. "Just fine, sweetheart," I said. "Time for breakfast?" Her smile lit up the room as she climbed out of bed. I followed her into the kitchen, breathing in the stale coffee smell and the promise of pancakes. But inside, my heart was full to bursting with guilt and grief. Every fiber of my being shuddered with the memory of that hallway, the luminous flash, the father's tears, and the girl's final broken breath. I would carry it with me into every conversation, every lesson, every bedtime story. The knowledge that some doors, once opened, never truly closed, and that sometimes in a heartbeat you choose between protector and predator, and you fail. I set a plate of pancakes in front of my daughters and sat opposite them. They chattered about school, their voices buoyant. I watched them laugh, their innocence unshaken. I took a sip of coffee, grimaced at its bitterness, and forced my face into a grin. "Can I have a piece of that too?" they asked in unison. I handed each a fork, patting the table. When they began to eat, I looked out the window at the day breaking. The sun's rays would climb higher, casting light on familiar streets, on unsuspecting lives. I realized that I would never escape the darkness I carried, the knowledge that I had ended a life that wasn't mine to take. The world would go on, but for me, time had already fractured. I was living in the quiet aftermath, the lonely hours between sunrise and sunset, with the echo of her final breath rattling my bones. I folded my hands in my lap, the plate before me untouched. As my daughters giggled, I closed my eyes and prayed silently that I'd find some way to live with what I had done. I whispered into the soft morning air, "I'm so sorry, Emily." I'm so sorry. And I realized that no apology, no plea, no desperation would ever bring her back. The only thing left was to keep breathing, keep moving, and live with the stillness of her loss ringing in my ears like a haunting refrain. The daylight slanted through the kitchen window in slats of gold, and as I spooned steaming coffee into my mug, the weight in my chest threatened to buckle my knees again. My daughters chattered at the table, one talking about a science project, the other demanding extra syrup, yet I could hear nothing but the echo of their laughter, fractured by last night's horror. Every clink of the fork against the plate felt like a hammer striking in my skull, reminding me that a child's life had ended because of my actions. I forced down the coffee in 2 gulps, the bitter liquid scorching my throat, the bloodstain on my uniform I'd tried, and failed, to wash away. Once breakfast was over, I drove my daughters to school in near silence. They chattered excitedly about art class and soccer practice, but their words felt like white noise. I clutched the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds to ensure they were safe, because I couldn't bear the thought of anything happening to them. But safety was an illusion. Last night I'd learned just how quickly innocence could be snuffed out. I dropped them off at the school's front entrance, watching as they bounded into the bright hallway full of lockers and laughter. Their backpacks bounced against their shoulders like tiny balloons. I wanted to call them back, to wrap them in my arms and refuse to let them go. But I didn't, because I knew the world would demand they face reality without me shielding them forever. When I returned home, the house felt cavernous. The living room was empty except for the faint hum of the television I'd left on overnight. The couch cushions were dented where I'd fallen asleep in full gear, and a stray Barbie shoe lay on the floor, Emily's Barbie, left behind when I finally stormed out. I stared at it, half expecting it to spin toward me on its own, as though she might reappear to pick it up. The absurdity of that thought nearly made me laugh, until I remembered she would never pick it up again. I showered again, hot water this time, scalding until my skin nearly blistered. I scrubbed at my scalp, searching for any strand of her hair, but found nothing. Still, I could smell her in the steam. Her blood lingered like a phantom scent. I scrubbed until the water ran clear, until my knuckles pruned. When I finally stepped out, pink and raw, I caught my reflection in the fogged-up mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, hair plastered to my forehead, face drawn tight. I looked older, weathered, like someone had carved grief into my cheeks overnight. Dressed in a crisp patrol uniform, shirt tucked in, badge polished, my reflection felt like a cruel joke. How could this uniform, this symbol of protection and authority, hang over my shoulder when I'd failed so completely? I grabbed my service weapon, checking the chamber as if living bullets could absolve me. I holstered it anyway, but I felt its weight more now than ever. The unit insignia on my shoulder seemed tarnished, a stain that no polishing rag could remove. I drove to the station, the morning traffic a blur of cars and brake lights. As I pulled into the lot, I saw Reynolds leaning against his cruiser, who didn't acknowledge me until I circled the patrol area to park. When I stepped out, he straightened and met my gaze with hollow eyes. "Mercer," he said, voice low. "You okay?" I shook my head. "I'm fine," I lied. He didn't press further. We walked into the station together, the silence between us heavy with unspoken tragedy. In the briefing room, Captain Ellis and Lieutenant Sanford waited. Sanford's hand was again bandaged, the cut on his palm healed, but the memory of her blood still stained the gauze. Ellis gave me a nod, an acknowledgement that we were here to resume normalcy, despite the fact that nothing would ever be normal again. "Today, we need to route forensics to upload evidence from 2B, Ellis said. pointing to a tablet screen displaying photo files. The shattered door, the sofa stained crimson, the collapsed body of a little girl. I stared at them, unable to look away. We also have the community meeting at 10. The mayor wants SWAT represented. He wants assurances that we're still in control. The media will be there. We'll need a statement. A statement. How could we craft words that would soothe the community while hiding the knife of my guilt behind a mask of professionalism? I swallowed, tasting bile. Understood. Sanford cleared his throat. CPL Martinez and Corporal Reynolds will handle evidence collection at the funeral home this afternoon, he said, motioning to the tablet. Reynolds, you'll ride in unmarked with a detection K9 to make sure there are no other threats. Martinez, escort Alvarez to the DA's office for preliminary interrogation. He paused, and I saw the raw edge in his eyes, empathy laced with his own self-reproach. Mercer, you'll handle the media statement. We want to speak at noon. He turned, leaving me to imagine the images he saw behind closed eyes, the girl's eyes empty, staring at the ceiling. I nodded again. I'll do it. My voice was a whisper in the expanse of the room. They exchanged looks but said nothing more. I stood behind the lectern, rehearsing my words silently. Today, SWAT regrets the tragic outcome at Tanager Street, I murmured. We extend our condolences to the Alvarez family. We are reviewing procedures to prevent such incidents from happening again. Every cliché felt like a betrayal, but I had to say something. We gathered for the 9:45 a.m. community meeting at City Hall, a nondescript brick building where reporters milled in the foyer. Cameras and microphones were set up in the council chamber. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. I scanned the audience, parents clutching toddlers, elderly couples in wheelchairs, young officers in uniform. Their faces registered a mixture of anger, confusion, grief. I felt a wave of nausea, knowing their questions would pierce the thin veneer of my prepared statement. At exactly noon, Captain Ellis introduced me and took his seat behind the dais. I stepped up to the microphone, the glare of camera lights burning in my eyes. I felt every bead of sweat on my forehead. I heard a faint squeak as I cleared my throat. The flash of bulbs was hypnotic, like I was staring into the sun. Good afternoon, I began, voice steady, despite the quiver in my chest. I'm Sergeant Alex Mercer, lead for Delta Company SWAT. On behalf of our team, I want to express our deepest condolences to the Alvarez family. No words can fully address the loss of young Emily. My throat tightened. I swallowed, vision swimming. Last night, during an attempted barricade entry, an exchange of gunfire resulted in Emily being critically wounded. Despite our immediate medical efforts, she tragically succumbed to her injuries. I paused, seeing a mother in the front row, covering her mouth with her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. I exhaled and continued. We are working with the district attorney to establish a full timeline of events. We are also coordinating with the Department of Justice for an external review to assess our protocols and training. We pledge to you, our community, that SWAT will learn from this, and we will implement any necessary changes to prevent such a tragedy from occurring in the future. There was a solemn hush. One reporter raised a hand. I nodded to him. Sergeant, the public wants to know, was this a case of negligence? Why was a flashbang deployed when a child was present? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I could see the outrage in his eyes, the demand for blame. My instincts screamed for me to defend my team, to say that we did everything by the book. But I couldn't lie. At present, I said, voice measured, we believe our officers followed standard procedure based on the intel we had. However, we recognize that the suspect, Mr. Alvarez, was in possession of an assault rifle. and had indicated Emily would be harmed if we approached. We believed that a brief disorientation device, the words tasted sour, would create an opportunity for us to subdue him without putting Emily directly at risk. Unfortunately, the outcome was catastrophic. We are reviewing whether different tactics, including negotiation protocols, could have been more effective. A murmur rippled through the crowd. More hands raised. I answered as best I could, my words crisp, professional. But behind them lay the unspoken truth I couldn't voice, that in those split seconds, I had made a decision that killed a child, that I had lifted my foot at the very moment her life, and mine, shattered. After the meeting, I left without looking back. The station's halls felt cavernous again. I retreated to the squad room where only my laptop and a half-empty coffee cup remained. I opened a blank document and stared at the blinking cursor. I had to write a full after-action report, account for every decision, every protocol. But I couldn't bring myself to type. My fingers hovered over the keys, trembling. The report demanded clarity, times, communications, roles. But none of that would capture the agony burning in my chest or the image of Emily's empty eyes. Corporal Reynolds approached, slipping a coffee mug into my hand. Black, just as I liked it. He sat across from me, eyes dark. "Mercer, they sent Alvarez to solitary. They'll keep him there until the DA's office sees him." We picked up his phone, no last calls. We found pictures of Emily on the lock screen. He was obsessed. He paused. "Captain says he wants you to rest, but I know how that goes." I exhaled, swirled the coffee, bitter ground swirling inside. "I need to write the report," I said, "and then I need to drive by Tanager Street." Reynolds nodded. He understood. We both understood that rest was a luxury we couldn't afford if we wanted to confront what had happened. I left the station at 3 p.m. and drove alone, radio off, toward Tanager Street. As I turned onto the block, the afternoon sun was low, casting long shadows across the pavement. The apartment building stood silent, front entrance sealed by yellow police tape fluttering in a lazy breeze. A single photograph of Emily, placed on a makeshift memorial, was taped to a street lamp, her smiling face beneath the words, "Always in our hearts." Flowers, candles, a child's drawing of a house lined the base of the lamppost. I parked, a few yards away, engine idling, and grabbed a disposable camera from the passenger seat, my backup in case the station's network went down. I wanted a record, not of evidence, but of grief. I stepped out and felt the afternoon air press against me, warm and heavy. The smell of damp earth and fading flowers filled my nostrils. As I approached, I noticed new graffiti on the brick wall. Someone had scrawled, "Justice for Emily," in red paint, the letters dripping like blood. Beneath it, another message. How many more? I could feel the thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. I walked closer, careful not to step on the memorial items. My boots crunched on loose gravel. I lifted the camera and snapped a photo of the taped-off entrance, barely visible beyond a row of orange traffic cones. I lowered the camera and looked at the warping metal door, once smashed inward, now welded shut. The scar in its frame was still visible, the metal bent, flecks of rust forming along the edges. I could imagine Emily's father prying his door open for the last time, seeing a team of strangers in black and green armor, hearing the hiss of the flashbang arcing in. I took another shot of the window behind the sofa, now boarded up, as if to hide the memory of what transpired. The plywood was freshly painted black. I ran my fingers over the wood's rough grain, feeling the splintered edge where the flashbang may have deflected. The sun's rays hit the board at an angle, making the chipped paint glisten like tires. From behind, I felt footsteps. I turned to see Lieutenant Sanford approaching, his uniform crisp but his face ashen. He walked slowly, as though trying to avoid the memories that clung to these walls. "Sergeant," he said softly. I took a shot of the memorial, flowers wilting, candles melted into soft puddles. He held up his own camera. "The community is holding a vigil tonight. They want to know why we had to bring death to their doorstep." I nodded, too choked to reply. The sun had dipped lower, coating the brick in a blood-red hue. I saw the magazine taped to the shotgun Martinez had dropped, thrown into evidence. I saw children playing in the nearby park, oblivious to the tragedy just a block away. Their laughter pealed through the air like a cruel reminder. My fingers tightened around the camera. I lifted it to snap a final photo, Emily's portrait on the lamppost. I framed her face, still smiling, eyes bright, golden hair in 2 braids. I clicked, and the flash lit up the memorial like a beacon. For a second, I could almost see her reaching out, tugging on my jacket. But then the light faded, and I lowered the camera. The image forever captured inside that little piece of film. I placed a single flower, white lily, at the base of the lamppost. The petals felt fragile in my hand, like they might crumble under the weight of memory. I knelt and arranged them among the wilted bouquets and melted candles. I traced a fingertip along the words, "Always in our hearts," and felt my chest tighten. A soft breeze rustled the papers, and I could have sworn I heard a child's whisper, "Why?" I stood and took a step back, trying to hold the composure that duty demanded. But as I gazed at her portrait, the afternoon's golden glow warped into something warped and sinister in my mind. I could see her standing behind me, translucent in the shadows, looking into my eyes with the same empty stare I'd seen last night. I spun around, panicked, but there was no one. The street lay silent. The apartment building loomed behind me, a mausoleum of guilt. The sun dipped behind the roofline, tinting the sky in storms of purple and orange. The world felt as if it held its breath. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush against my face. In that suspended moment, I felt the final fracture open inside me. I realized that no matter how many ceremonies, how many photo records, how many procedural changes we implemented, nothing would restore the beating heart that I had helped extinguish. When I opened my eyes, I saw a single folded drawing placed among the flowers. One of my daughter's school art prints. A stick figure family standing under a rainbow. They'd drawn it earlier this morning and slipped it into my patrol bag, knowing Daddy had a big day at work. The corners were damp with dew. Now it lay innocently next to Emily's portrait. I could not reconcile the 2 images, one of a smiling child anticipating a father's embrace after school, and one of a child lost forever because of that same father's misguided mission. I bent and picked up the drawing, running my thumb along the frayed edges. In the dimming light, the rainbow's colors looked faded, as though someone had tried to erase joy from it. I realized that no matter how I tried to shield my daughters, there was no returning to childhood's simplicity. I would carry this guilt, this unanswerable question, why, into every hug, every bedtime story, every unguarded moment. Because now I knew, some doors, once opened, could never be closed. I placed the drawing back among the flowers, letting the wind lift the edges like a soft sigh. The colors gleamed under the street lamp's flicker, a twisted beacon of hope and horror intertwined. I stepped back and raised my camera for one final shot, but instead of pressing the button, I turned it off and slipped it into my pocket. I realized then that no photograph could capture the weight of this moment, the depth of my failure. The real image was etched behind my eyes, a ribbon of dust motes dancing in the strobe haze, the lifeless eyes of a child, and the father's agonized sob. I walked away from the memorial, my footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. Each step felt like I was leaving a piece of my soul behind. As I got into my cruiser, the street lamp's light flickered and went out, plunging Tanager Street into darkness. In that final instant, I saw a single, haunting image etched into my mind, a little girl's lifeless hand, separated forever from warmth, reaching for a world that no longer held her. I closed the door and sat behind the wheel, the engine's rumble a hollow heartbeat in the night. I stared through the windshield at the darkened building, its windows blank, its memories simmering in the shadows. Then I exhaled, low and jagged, and whispered into the cool air, "I'm so sorry." The words evaporated into the darkness, unheard by all but a memory that would never fade.